Hill House stood alone, dark and foreboding against the backdrop of the hills. It loomed over the landscape like a forgotten giant, its jagged edges cutting sharply into the sky. For decades, rumors of its malevolence spread far and wide. People spoke in whispers about the strange happenings within its walls, events that no one could quite explain. Now, it was about to host a new group of visitors, each with their own reasons for being drawn to the house's mystery. Little did they know, they would leave with much more than they expected. Dr. John Montague, a scholar of the supernatural, was the one who had orchestrated this visit. A methodical man with a quiet obsession, he had spent years collecting accounts of haunted places, but Hill House was different. It had a reputation that made even the most hardened skeptic shudder. It wasn't just another haunted house. It was something worse, something alive in its own way. Dr. Montague believed that if he could document its phenomena, he would finally have the proof he needed to establish his theories on the supernatural. The doctor had invited 3 others to accompany him for the summer. Eleanor Vance was the first to accept the invitation. She was a woman who, for most of her life, had been invisible to the world. At 32, Eleanor had spent her youth caring for her ailing mother in a life of solitude. When her mother passed, Eleanor was left with nothing but her bitterness and regret. The invitation from Dr. Montague offered her something she had never had, an escape. Eleanor had no home to speak of, no career, and no one waiting for her anywhere. The idea of escaping the Hill House, even with its dark reputation, was better than returning to her sister's house, where she was nothing more than an unwanted burden. As she drove through the countryside, Eleanor felt a rush of exhilaration, a fleeting sense of freedom she hadn't known in years. But as the miles disappeared behind her and Hill House drew nearer, an uneasy feeling began to creep in. The second guest was Theodora, an artist with a sharp wit and a tendency to hide her true emotions behind laughter and sarcasm. She was everything Eleanor wasn't: confident, carefree, and vibrant. Dr. Montague had chosen her because of her supposed psychic sensitivity, although Theodora never took such things seriously. For her, this was just another adventure, a way to pass the time during the summer. Luke Sanderson, the final member of the group, was the heir to Hill House. Though he had never set foot inside it before, Luke wasn't thrilled about spending his time in a place everyone in his family avoided. But he was obliged to join the others, both because it was his inheritance and because his aunt insisted. To him, Hill House was simply an old structure, nothing more. He wasn't particularly interested in the supernatural, but he wasn't about to turn down the opportunity to meet new people and enjoy some good company. The 3 guests arrived separately, each with their own expectations, but all were struck by the sight of Hill House when they first laid eyes on it. Its towering walls seemed to lean toward them, as if they were being drawn into its grasp. The house was more than just unsettling. It was wrong in some unspoken way. The architecture was deliberately designed to disorient, with sharp angles and strange curves that made the house feel unnatural. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, ready to trap anyone foolish enough to step inside. Eleanor was the first to arrive, her heart pounding as she approached the iron gates. She hesitated, gripping the wheel of her car tightly. Her first instinct was to turn back, to leave Hill House and never look back. But something kept her there. Perhaps it was her longing for a place where she could belong, or perhaps it was something darker, an unspoken pull from the house itself. With a deep breath, Eleanor pushed forward, driving through the gates and up the gravel road toward the house. As she parked and stepped out of the car, the stillness of the place enveloped her. No birds sang, no wind stirred the trees. It was as if the house existed in a world separate from everything else. As she made her way to the entrance, the heavy wooden doors creaked open, and she was greeted by Mrs. Dudley, the housekeeper, a doorwoman with a cold demeanor. Mrs. Dudley made it clear that she had no interest in the guests or their experiments. She had one job: to keep the house running, and she wasn't going to stick around after dark. "I leave before nightfall," she said flatly, her voice devoid of emotion. "No one stays after dark." Eleanor shivered, unsure if the warning was meant for her or if it was just Mrs. Dudley's way of doing things. Either way, the message was clear. Hill House had its own rules, and the living didn't belong there once the sun went down. Soon after, Theodora and Luke arrived, both of them trying to mask their unease with light conversation. Dr. Montague greeted them warmly, his excitement barely contained. This was the beginning of his great experiment, and he was certain that Hill House would deliver the proof he sought. Together, the group explored the house, marveling at its grand but unsettling design. Every room felt wrong. The proportions were slightly off, and the angles made them feel like they were being watched. As night fell, the group gathered in the parlor, ready for the first of many nights at Hill House. Outside, the sun disappeared behind the hills, casting long shadows across the house. Inside, the air grew colder, and a heavy silence settled over them. Eleanor felt it first, a sense of dread creeping up her spine, as if the house was slowly closing in around her. She glanced at Theodora, who smiled, seemingly unaffected, but Eleanor could see the flicker of fear in her eyes. Luke, too, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Dr. Montague's voice broke the silence. "Welcome to Hill House," he said softly, "and may whatever walks here walk alone." But Eleanor knew, deep down, that they were never truly alone. Not in Hill House. The house had been waiting. The first night at Hill House was quiet unnervingly so. No disturbances, no cold drafts, no ghostly whispers. Just a heavy, suffocating stillness that seemed to press in on all sides. For the group, this silence felt like a reprieve, though none of them voiced their relief aloud. Dr. Montague had warned them that the house would take time to reveal its secrets, and so they settled into the routine of exploring the mansion, observing its strange features, and waiting for something to happen. Eleanor, in particular, was on edge. She had expected immediate signs of the supernatural, perhaps a door slamming on its own, or the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. But Hill House didn't offer any such obvious signs. Instead, it exerted a quieter, more insidious influence. There was something unsettling in the air, something unseen yet always present. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her, biding its time. Theodora, ever the optimist, treated the situation lightly. She made jokes to ease the tension, poking fun at the house's ominous reputation. "I was expecting more theatrics," she said one morning over breakfast. "A little poltergeist action, at least." Eleanor smiled, grateful for the attempt at levity, but the nagging sense of dread in the pit of her stomach never fully went away. Theodora seemed so at ease, but Eleanor wondered if it was just a mask to hide her own unease. Luke, on the other hand, appeared disinterested. He spent his time lounging around, flipping through old books he found in the library, while lazily inspecting the rooms. For him, this was nothing more than a bizarre vacation, and his carefree attitude irritated Eleanor. How could he be so indifferent when Hill House felt so palpably dangerous? Dr. Montague remained the most focused. He wandered the halls with his notebook, jotting down every strange detail, even if it was nothing more than a creaky floorboard or a faint change in temperature. He believed that the house would eventually begin to manifest its true nature, and he was determined not to miss a single moment. The doctor's presence reassured Eleanor, but only slightly. His rational explanations provided a counterbalance to her growing anxiety. But as each day passed, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was subtly changing inside her. As the days turned into nights, the group began to notice the small, almost imperceptible oddities that defined Hill House. The doors never stayed open, no matter how wide they were left. They always swung shut with a soft click, as if the house refused to let the outside world in. The angles of the rooms felt wrong, the corners too sharp or too curved, creating a sense of disorientation. At times, the halls seemed to stretch longer than they had before, as though the house were shifting itself around them. Eleanor found herself strangely drawn to the house, as if it were calling to her in some silent way. She would wander the halls alone, feeling a connection to the mansion she couldn't explain. The house's dark wood paneling and intricate carvings seemed to pulse with a life of their own. There were moments when Eleanor felt almost comforted by the oppressive stillness, as though Hill House understood her in a way no one else ever had. But along with that comfort came a growing sense of unease. Each night, Eleanor would wake in her bed, heart racing, convinced that someone or something was standing just outside her door. She would lie there, frozen, listening to the silence, trying to convince herself it was all in her mind. But the feeling of being watched never left her. The others began to feel it too. One evening, as they sat in the parlor, Theodora broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "Does anyone else feel like the house is staring at us?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. Luke raised an eyebrow, glancing around. "I wouldn't say staring," he replied, "but there's definitely something strange about this place." Dr. Montague nodded thoughtfully, as if he had expected this. "Hill House is known for its ability to influence," he said carefully. "It's not always about what you can see or hear. The house affects you in subtle ways. You might feel watched or uneasy, but it's all part of the experience. We must remain objective." Objective. Eleanor clung to that word, but it felt hollow. How could she remain objective when the walls themselves seemed to be closing in on her? She had never been one to believe in the supernatural, yet Hill House was doing something to her, something that made her question everything she thought she knew. The next night, the disturbances began in earnest. It started with a loud banging sound, echoing through the house. The group was gathered in the parlor when the noise rang out, startling them all. Theodora jumped, knocking over her teacup, while Luke muttered a curse under his breath. Dr. Montague stood, listening carefully. "Did you hear where it came from?" he asked, his voice tense. Eleanor shook her head, her heart pounding. The noise seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating off the walls. Another bang followed, then another, growing louder and more insistent. The sound was unlike anything Eleanor had ever heard, deep, guttural, and impossibly loud, as if the house itself was groaning in pain. "Stay together," Dr. Montague instructed, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. They huddled together, listening as the noise continued to echo through the halls. After what felt like an eternity, the banging stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind an eerie silence. Eleanor's breath came in shallow gasps. She could feel her pulse racing, her skin cold with fear. She wanted to believe it was just a structural issue old houses creaked, after all, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. Hill House was waking up, and it was starting to reach out. That night, the group decided to retire early, but sleep was elusive. Eleanor lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. She closed her eyes, trying to force herself to sleep, but the unease lingered. It was then that she heard a soft voice, barely audible, calling her name. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the voice came again, clearer this time. "Eleanor," it whispered, gentle yet insistent. Her eyes flew open, and she sat up in bed, heart pounding. The voice was coming from outside her door, just beyond the threshold. She swallowed, gripping the edges of the blanket tightly. Was someone playing a cruel trick on her, or was this the house? The possibility of either terrified her. She stayed frozen in bed, unable to move, until the voice faded into the silence once more. The fear lingered, even after the sound was gone. and Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the house had spoken to her personally, intimately, in a way that no one else had experienced. Hill House was no longer just a house. It was something more, something alive. And Eleanor feared it had chosen her. The first night at Hill House was quiet, unnervingly so. No disturbances, no cold drafts, no ghostly whispers. Just a heavy, suffocating stillness that seemed to press in on all sides. For the group, this silence felt like a reprieve, though none of them voiced their relief aloud. Dr. Montague had warned them that the house would take time to reveal its secrets, and so they settled into the routine of exploring the mansion, observing its strange features, and waiting for something to happen. Eleanor, in particular, was on edge. She had expected immediate signs of the supernatural, perhaps a door slamming on its own, or the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. But Hill House didn't offer any such obvious signs. Instead, it exerted a quieter, more insidious influence. There was something unsettling in the air, something unseen yet always present. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her, biding its time. Theodora, ever the optimist, treated the situation lightly. She made jokes to ease the tension, poking fun at the house's ominous reputation. "I was expecting more theatrics," she said one morning over breakfast. "A little poltergeist action, at least." Eleanor smiled, grateful for the attempt at levity, but the nagging sense of dread in the pit of her stomach never fully went away. Theodora seemed so at ease, but Eleanor wondered if it was just a mask to hide her own unease. Luke, on the other hand, appeared disinterested. He spent his time lounging around, flipping through old books he found in the library, or lazily inspecting the rooms. For him, this was nothing more than a bizarre vacation, and his carefree attitude irritated Eleanor. How could he be so indifferent when Hill House felt so palpably dangerous? Dr. Montague remained the most focused. He wandered the halls with his notebook, jotting down every strange detail, even if it was nothing more than a creaky floorboard or a faint change in temperature. He believed that the house would eventually begin to manifest its true nature, and he was determined not to miss a single moment. The doctor's presence reassured Eleanor, but only slightly. His rational explanations provided a counterbalance to her growing anxiety. But as each day passed, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was subtly changing inside her. As the days turned into nights, the group began to notice the small, almost imperceptible oddities that defined Hill House. The doors never stayed open, no matter how wide they were left. They always swung shut with a soft click, as if the house refused to let the outside world in. The angles of the rooms felt wrong, the corners too sharp or too curved, creating a sense of disorientation. At times, the halls seemed to stretch longer than they had before, as though the house were shifting itself around them. Eleanor found herself strangely drawn to the house, as if it were calling to her in some silent way. She would wander the halls alone, feeling a connection to the mansion she couldn't explain. The house's dark wood paneling and intricate carvings seemed to pulse with a life of their own. There were moments when Eleanor felt almost comforted by the oppressive stillness, as though Hill House understood her in a way no one else ever had. But along with that comfort came a growing sense of unease. Each night, Eleanor would wake in her bed, heart racing, convinced that someone or something was standing just outside her door. She would lie there, frozen, listening to the silence, trying to convince herself it was all in her mind. But the feeling of being watched never left her. The others began to feel it too. One evening, as they sat in the parlor, Theodora broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "Does anyone else feel like the house is staring at us?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. Luke raised an eyebrow, glancing around. "I wouldn't say staring," he replied, "but there's definitely something strange about this place." Dr. Montague nodded thoughtfully, as if he had expected this. "Hill House is known for its ability to influence," he said carefully. it's not always about what you can see or hear. The house affects you in subtle ways. You might feel watched or uneasy, but it's all part of the experience. We must remain objective. Objective. Eleanor clung to that word, but it felt hollow. How could she remain objective when the walls themselves seemed to be closing in on her? She had never been one to believe in the supernatural, yet Hill House was doing something to her, something that made her question everything she thought she knew. The next night, the disturbances began in earnest. It started with a loud banging sound, echoing through the house. The group was gathered in the parlor when the noise rang out, startling them all. Theodora jumped, knocking over her teacup, while Luke muttered a curse under his breath. Dr. Montague stood, listening carefully. "Did you hear where it came from?" he asked, his voice tense. Eleanor shook her head, her heart pounding. The noise seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating off the walls. Another bang followed, then another, growing louder and more insistent. The sound was unlike anything Eleanor had ever heard, deep, guttural, and impossibly loud, as if the house itself was groaning in pain. "Stay together," Dr. Montague instructed, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. They huddled together, listening as the noise continued to echo through the halls. After what felt like an eternity, the banging stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind an eerie silence. Eleanor's breath came in shallow gasps. She could feel her pulse racing, her skin cold with fear. She wanted to believe it was just a structural issue old houses creaked, after all, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. Hill House was waking up, and it was starting to reach out. That night, the group decided to retire early, but sleep was elusive. Eleanor lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. She closed her eyes, trying to force herself to sleep, but the unease lingered. It was then that she heard a soft voice, barely audible, calling her name. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the voice came again, clearer this time. "Eleanor," it whispered, gentle yet insistent. Her eyes flew open, and she sat up in bed, heart pounding. The voice was coming from outside her door, just beyond the threshold. She swallowed, gripping the edges of the blanket tightly. Was someone playing a cruel trick on her, or was this the house? The possibility of either terrified her. She stayed frozen in bed, unable to move, until the voice faded into the silence once more. The fear lingered, even after the sound was gone, and Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the house had spoken to her personally, intimately, in a way that no one else had experienced. Hill House was no longer just a house. It was something more, something alive, and Eleanor feared it had chosen her. The days in Hill House began to blur, each one bleeding into the next. The once playful atmosphere among the group had grown tense, weighed down by the increasing strangeness that seemed to infest every corner of the mansion. The subtle disturbances that had started with noises and inexplicable cold spots were now escalating into something far more sinister. Eleanor felt it most acutely. Each night, her dreams became more vivid, more disorienting. Shadows danced across her room, and she swore she could hear whispers, the same voice that had called her name that first night. The voice no longer startled her, though. Ugh. Instead, she found herself listening for it, waiting for it to speak again. And when it did, it was almost comforting, as though the house understood her deepest thoughts and longings. But that comfort came with a price. Hill House was changing Eleanor. Where once she had been shy, withdrawn, and uncertain, now she felt a strange, dark confidence creeping in. It wasn't the kind of confidence that made her feel stronger. It was more like a weight pressing down on her, pushing her to let go of her old self. Every time she wandered the house alone, she felt it pulling her further into its grasp, as if it were slowly becoming a part of her. The others noticed the change in her, but no one spoke of it directly. Theodora, ever sensitive to the emotions of those around her, had grown distant from Eleanor. Where they once shared a bond, an unspoken tension now lingered between them. Theodora still laughed and joked, but her gaze had become sharp, suspicious. She was watching Eleanor carefully, as if she were afraid of what her friend might do, or perhaps of what the house might do to her. One evening, as they gathered in the parlor, Theodora finally confronted Eleanor, though her words were veiled in humor. "You're looking a little pale, Eleanor," she said with a playful smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hill House isn't agreeing with you, is it?" Eleanor bristled at the comment, her nerves already frayed from the sleepless nights and the constant feeling of being watched. "I'm fine," she snapped, more harshly than she intended. She immediately regretted it, but the words were out, and she saw the flicker of surprise and perhaps fear in Theodora's expression. Dr. Montague, ever the mediator, stepped in to ease the tension. "We're all under a lot of stress," he said calmly. "Hill House has a way of playing tricks on the mind. It's important that we stick together and not let the house influence us." But even as he spoke, the house seemed to respond. A loud, hollow knock echoed through the walls, as if something was rapping on the wood from within. The noise reverberated through the room, freezing them in place. Eleanor's heart pounded as she listened. It wasn't just a random sound. It was deliberate, rhythmic, almost as if someone or something was trying to get in. Luke, who had been lounging carelessly in his chair, jumped to his feet, his face pale. What the hell was that? He muttered, his usual nonchalance gone. Dr. Montague motioned for calm, but the tension was thick in the air. "Everyone stay together," he ordered. "We've prepared for this. It's just the house. It's reacting to us." Reacting. Eleanor felt the word sink into her mind like a stone. The house wasn't just reacting, it was communicating. She could feel it. It was reaching out, trying to make contact, and she was the one it had chosen. The knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent. The group huddled closer together, their fear palpable. For a moment, Eleanor felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to escape the house's grasp and never look back. But even as the thought crossed her mind, another voice, her own, but darker, quieter, whispered inside her, "This is where you belong. Don't leave, not yet." The noise abruptly stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The group sat frozen, their breaths shallow, waiting for the next attack, but nothing came. After what felt like hours, Dr. Montague finally spoke. "It's over for now," he said, though his voice was tense. "We need to stay vigilant. The house is testing us." They retired to their rooms early that night, though none of them expected to sleep. Eleanor lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, the events of the evening replaying in her mind. The knocking, the tension, Theodora's strange look, all of it felt like a warning. But from whom? From the house? Or from herself? Sleep, when it finally came, was shallow and filled with disturbing dreams. Eleanor found herself wandering through the dark corridors of Hill House, but the walls were different, now closer, more confining. They seemed to pulse with life, breathing in sync with her own panicked breaths. As she walked, the floor shifted beneath her feet, and the air grew thick, almost suffocating. In her dream, the house whispered to her again, that same familiar voice. "You can't leave, Eleanor. You don't want to. This is where you're meant to be." She awoke in a cold sweat, her heart racing. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, the dream still clinging to her like a second skin. The room was dark, the shadows deep and unfamiliar, but the overwhelming sense of being watched was all too real. Eleanor glanced at the door. It was closed, just as she had left it, but something was wrong. She could feel it. Slowly, she swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet touching the cold floor. She stood, hesitating for a moment, then moved toward the door, her heart pounding in her ears. When she opened it, the hallway stretched out before her, empty and silent. But the moment she stepped outside, she felt the temperature drop. The cold wrapped around her like a tight grip, and the air seemed to hum with a low, steady vibration. She wasn't alone. Something was out there, lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. The whisper came again, soft but insistent. "Come closer, Eleanor." She didn't move. She couldn't. Her body felt frozen, as if the house had taken control of her limbs, holding her in place. The whisper grew louder, more demanding, as if it were coming from inside her own mind. Closer. Eleanor clenched her fists, fighting the urge to move, to obey. But the pull was too strong. She took one step forward, then another, her feet moving of their own accord. The shadows in the hallway seemed to shift, growing darker, thicker, until they almost swallowed her whole. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the feeling vanished. The cold dissipated, the air returned to normal, and Eleanor was left standing in the middle of the hallway, trembling. She didn't know how long she stood there, but when she finally gathered the strength to return to her room, she collapsed onto the bed, exhausted and terrified. The next morning, she told no one what had happened. Not Theodora, not Dr. Montague, not even Luke, who seemed as unaffected by the house as ever. But Eleanor knew that something inside her had changed. The house had touched her, reached into her mind, and planted a seed of doubt that was slowly growing. Hill House was no longer just a building. It was something more, a living entity, feeding off their fear, twisting their thoughts, and slowly unraveling their sense of reality. And Eleanor, whether she admitted it or not, was becoming part of it. By the time the 4th week in Hill House arrived, the atmosphere had shifted from eerie to oppressive. Every inch of the house seemed charged with a malevolent energy that none of them could fully explain. No longer content with subtle whispers and cold drafts, the house had grown more active, more aggressive. It was as if the mansion itself was waking up, and its attention was fixed on Eleanor. Theodora, once a source of comfort with her sharp wit and playful teasing, now kept her distance from Eleanor. The tension between them was palpable, and Eleanor couldn't ignore the feeling that Theodora was afraid of her, or rather, of what the house was doing to her. The unspoken barrier between them only made Eleanor feel more isolated, more trapped in her own mind. She began to question whether Theodora had ever truly been her friend, or if she had just been pretending all along. Luke, who had never taken the haunting seriously, was becoming more and more irritable. His usual carefree attitude had given way to frustration, and he spent much of his time pacing through the house, as though he was searching for an escape. But there was no escape, not from Hill House. The mansion's strange geometry seemed to twist and turn in on itself, making the corridors feel endless and the rooms disorienting. Even when they tried to leave, the house had a way of leading them back inside. Dr. Montague was still focused on his research, scribbling notes with frantic determination. But even he was beginning to show signs of strain. His once calm demeanor had cracked, revealing the deep anxiety beneath. The house was proving more powerful than he had anticipated, and though he tried to maintain a scientific detachment, it was clear that Hill House had shaken him. He had lost control of the experiment, and he knew it. Eleanor, meanwhile, was slipping further into the house's grip. Her dreams had become darker, more vivid, and the line between reality and imagination was blurring. She could no longer tell if the strange things she was experiencing were real, or if the house was playing tricks on her mind. The whispers had become more frequent, more persistent, and they no longer scared her. In fact, she had started to listen to them, to find comfort in their words. They understand me. The house understands me. It was a dangerous thought, but Eleanor couldn't help it. The more isolated she felt from the others, the more she turned to the house for comfort. It whispered to her, telling her that she belonged there, that she didn't need the others. And Eleanor began to believe it. One night, after another unsettling evening filled with unexplained noises and shifting shadows, Eleanor found herself wandering the halls of Hill House alone. She didn't know what had drawn her out of bed. Perhaps it was the pull of the house, or perhaps it was her own restless mind. Either way, she found herself moving through the mansion's darkened corridors, the wooden floorboards creaking softly beneath her feet. The house seemed to breathe around her, its very walls pulsating with a strange energy. Eleanor felt calm, almost serene, as if she were finally where she was meant to be. For the first time in her life, she felt seen. Truly seen. She came to a door at the end of the hallway, one she had never noticed before. It was slightly ajar, as if inviting her inside. Without hesitation, she pushed it open and stepped into the room beyond. It was a small, dimly lit space with a single window that looked out over the dark, empty grounds of Hill House. The air in the room was cold, but Eleanor didn't feel the chill. Instead, she felt a strange warmth radiating from the center of the room. There, in the middle of the floor, was a mirror. Its surface was cracked, the fractured glass reflecting distorted images of the room and of Eleanor herself. She stepped closer, staring at her reflection. Her face looked pale, drawn, and tired, but there was something else in her eyes, something dark and unfamiliar. The mirror whispered to her, "You don't need them. They're holding you back. You've always been alone, Eleanor. But here, you can be free. You can be yourself." Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached out to touch the mirror's cracked surface. The moment her fingers brushed the glass, she felt a surge of energy course through her. It wasn't painful, but it was overwhelming, like the house itself was pouring its power into her. For a brief, terrifying moment, Eleanor felt as though she were losing herself. The weight of her loneliness, her grief, her anger, it all pressed down on her, threatening to consume her. But the house whispered again, soothing her. "Let go, Eleanor. Let go of who you were. Be free." And she did. In that moment, standing before the cracked mirror, Eleanor let go. She let go of the years she had spent caring for her mother, of the bitterness and resentment that had built up inside her. She let go of the shame, the regret, the feeling of being invisible. And as she did, she felt something shift within her, something dark, something powerful. The house had given her a gift. It had taken her pain, her loneliness, and turned it into something else, something stronger. When Eleanor returned to the others the next morning, they noticed the change immediately. Her demeanor was different, calmer, more assured, but there was something unsettling about the way she carried herself. Theodora watched her with wary eyes, while Luke seemed to avoid her altogether. Even Dr. Montague appeared unnerved, though he said nothing. That day, the disturbances escalated. The walls groaned under an invisible pressure, and strange, unexplainable phenomena occurred throughout the house. Doors slammed shut with deafening force, and objects moved on their own. It was as if Hill House was coming alive, feeding off the group's fear and uncertainty. And through it all, Eleanor remained calm. She no longer felt afraid of the house. She felt connected to it. The house had chosen her, and she had accepted it. But Theodora wasn't fooled. That evening, as they sat together in the parlor, Theodora turned to Eleanor, her voice low and tense. "What's happening to you?" she asked. Her eyes narrowed. "You're not the same, Eleanor. You're different." Eleanor smiled, but it wasn't the warm, shy smile she had once worn. It was something colder, more distant. "I'm fine," she said softly. "I just realized something, that's all." Theodora shook her head, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "This house is doing something to you. It's trying to take you. Don't you see that?" Eleanor's smile faded. "Maybe I don't want to leave," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe this is where I belong." Theodora stared at her, horrified. Eleanor, no. This isn't you. The house is manipulating you. But Eleanor had stopped listening. The house's whispers were louder now, drowning out Theodora's voice. You don't need her. She's afraid of you. She'll never understand. And Eleanor believed it. She no longer needed the others. Hill House had given her something far more valuable, a sense of belonging, a place where she could finally be free. The cracks that had formed in her mind were spreading, and Eleanor could feel herself slipping further and further into the house's grasp. She didn't fight it. In the days that followed, the manifestations grew more violent. The house was unraveling, its dark energy seeping into every corner, every crevice. The others tried to reason with Eleanor, to pull her back, but it was too late. Hill House had claimed her, and she had let it. The house had become her refuge, her sanctuary, and she wasn't going to leave. Not ever. The final days in Hill House were a descent into chaos. The mansion, once eerie but manageable, now seemed intent on consuming those within it. Every room, every hallway felt alive with a malevolent energy that no one could ignore. The subtle games Hill House had played, the knocks, the whispers were gone. Now, it was a full assault. The house wanted them out. Or worse, it wanted to trap them there forever. Eleanor had fully surrendered to its pull. Her connection to the house had deepened to the point where she could no longer tell where she ended and Hill House began. The whispers that had once haunted her in the dark now filled her mind even in the daylight. They were no longer warnings or invitations. They were commands, insistent and relentless. Stay. You belong here. Let go of everything else. This is your home. Dr. Montague was the first to openly acknowledge the danger Eleanor was in. His once scientific curiosity had turned into concern. We need to leave, he said to the group, his voice strained with the realization that he had lost control of the situation. The house is becoming dangerous, especially for Eleanor. It's influencing her, perhaps more than we understand. But Eleanor wasn't listening. She was sitting by the window, gazing out into the bleak, foggy landscape that surrounded Hill House. Her expression was distant, almost peaceful, as though she was no longer part of the conversation. In her mind, the house was all that mattered. The outside world had become irrelevant. Theodora's patience had long since run out. We can't just sit here and watch this happen, she snapped, her usual sharpness undercut by real fear. She glanced over at Eleanor, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and concern. She's not herself anymore. The house has taken her, and we have to do something. Luke, standing near the door, looked ready to leave at any moment. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a cold, hard fear that he couldn't shake. We've stayed too long, he muttered. We need to get out while we still can. But Eleanor wasn't leaving. She had made that clear. And more than that, the house wouldn't let her go. The others could sense it. Hill House had its grip on her, and it wasn't about to loosen. That night, the house showed its full power. The walls shook, the floors groaned, and doors slammed with a force that rattled the entire structure. It felt like the house was coming apart at the seams, but instead of fear, Eleanor felt exhilaration. The house was alive, and it was speaking to her. It wanted her. As the others scrambled in panic, trying to figure out whether to flee or huddle together in safety, Eleanor moved calmly through the chaos. The shadows seemed to reach for her, embracing her as she walked through the darkened halls. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, but they no longer frightened her. You're home, Eleanor. This is where you've always belonged. The others tried to stop her. Theodora reached for her arm, pleading with her to come back to reality. But Eleanor pulled away with a strength that startled her friend. Dr. Montague tried to reason with her, his voice breaking with desperation, but his words didn't reach her. Luke, too scared to even approach her, watched from a distance, his face pale and drawn. Eleanor moved toward the grand staircase, her steps slow and deliberate. The house had led her there, guiding her to this final moment. The staircase loomed before her, a towering symbol of the house's power. She could feel the air around her vibrating with energy, as if the house itself was alive, watching her every move. As she stood at the top of the stairs, the voices filled her mind completely. "End it here, Eleanor. This is your final step. It's the only way to be free." For a brief moment, Eleanor hesitated. She looked down at the others below, their faces filled with horror and helplessness. But their fear felt distant to her now. The house had become her reality, and the people she once called friends were just shadows in her mind. Then, without another thought, Eleanor let herself go. But as she took the step forward, something in her shifted. A small, quiet voice, her own, fought its way through the cacophony of whispers. "Is this really what I want?" For a moment, Eleanor faltered. The house seemed to tighten its grip, but her mind, buried deep beneath the house's influence, was fighting back. She thought of the life she had left behind, lonely, yes, but still hers. She remembered the kindness of strangers, the feeling of sunlight on her face, the warmth of a world beyond Hill House. Was it really too late to turn back? But the house was relentless. There is no turning back. This is where you belong. You can't escape now. The others watched in horror as Eleanor wavered at the top of the staircase. Dr. Montague shouted her name, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. Theodora cried out, rushing toward the stairs, but Luke held her back, too afraid of what Eleanor might do. And then, with a final, shattering cry, Eleanor stepped forward. The house roared around her as she fell. Time seemed to slow as she tumbled down the stairs, her body twisting in the air. The others rushed to her, their footsteps pounding against the floor as they raced to catch her. But it was too late. Eleanor lay crumpled at the base of the staircase, her eyes closed, her body still. For a moment, there was only silence. The house, as if satisfied, seemed to calm. The groaning walls, the slamming doors, they all stopped. Hill House was still, as though it had finally taken what it wanted. Dr. Montague knelt beside Eleanor, his hand shaking as he checked for signs of life. Theodora stood frozen, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. Luke hovered nearby, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a hollow fear. But Eleanor was alive. She stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open, and for a brief moment, she looked at the others as though seeing them for the first time in weeks. Her voice, weak but clear, broke the silence. I'm sorry," she whispered. The house remained quiet as they gathered her up, carrying her carefully to her room. The others didn't speak, their minds too overwhelmed by what had happened. Eleanor, too weak to stand, allowed herself to be led away. As she lay in bed that night, her body aching, her mind exhausted, Eleanor finally understood. Hill House had tried to take her, but something within her had resisted. She had come to the edge, looked into the abyss, and somehow she had pulled back. For now, but the house wasn't done with her. She could still feel its pull, still hear its whispers in the back of her mind. The fight wasn't over, and Eleanor knew it. Hill House was a living thing, and it didn't let go easily. As the house settled into its familiar, oppressive silence, Eleanor closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she would leave. She had to. But part of her wondered if she would ever truly be free of Hill House, or if it had already taken more of her than she realized. In the heart of St. Louis, Missouri, during the late 1800s, the Lemp family stood as one of the most prominent and prosperous dynasties in the region. The family's name was synonymous with success, luxury, and innovation. Their pride and joy The Lemp Brewery had grown to be one of the largest and most influential breweries in America, setting them apart as leaders in the booming beer industry. The Lemp family's ascent to fortune seemed unstoppable, and at the height of their wealth, they built what would become their most lasting legacy, the Lemp Mansion. It was in 1868 that Johann Adam Lemp, the patriarch of the family, laid the foundations for the brewery that would revolutionize the production and distribution of lager beer in the United States. His innovative techniques for brewing and preserving beer catapulted the Lemp name into national fame, with their product becoming a staple in saloons and homes across the country. Lemp's vision was bold and unwavering. His brewery quickly expanded, and soon, the Lemp family reaped the rewards of his ingenuity. The Lemp Mansion itself was a testament to the family's immense success. Constructed in the early 1860s, this grand, stately home overlooked the bustling streets of St. Louis. It wasn't merely a house, but a symbol of power, wealth, and dominance. With its sprawling rooms, luxurious furnishings, and cutting-edge architecture for the time, the mansion was designed to host high society gatherings, grand parties, and exclusive business meetings. For years, the Lemp family lived a life of opulence and grandeur within its walls. At the helm of this empire was William J. Lemp, Johann's son, who took over the family business following his father's death. Under William's leadership, the brewery soared to even greater heights. The mansion, too, expanded, growing to include secret tunnels leading to the brewery, a horse stable, and a state-of-the-art auditorium. The Lemps were the envy of St. Louis, their name attached to every major event and charity in town. The mansion thrived as a hub of business and social life, but there was something else brewing within the family, a darker force that no amount of wealth could stop. Beneath the surface of their gilded lives, there were cracks beginning to form, small and unnoticed by the public. The family's growing wealth came with pressures and burdens that weighed heavily on its members. William Lemp's tireless work ethic, which had pushed the brewery to unprecedented success, had also taken a toll on him and those around him. While the family continued to host lavish parties and entertain prominent figures in their mansion, behind the closed doors of their private rooms, they struggled with inner turmoil. William Lemp Jr., William Sr.'s son, who would later take over the business, was often seen as the heir to this mighty empire. However, even as a young man, William Jr. wrestled with the weight of the family's expectations. While the mansion was filled with laughter and music during its many social events, William Jr. often found himself wandering the halls in solitude, caught between his father's shadow and his own insecurities. By the late 19th century, the Lemp Brewery had become one of the largest in the country, but with success came even more challenges. Competitors began to rise, and the beer market grew fiercer. William Jr. knew that to maintain their dominance, the Lemp family would need to adapt, but the weight of running the brewery had already taken a toll on him. Inside the grand Lemp Mansion, the walls that had once echoed with joy and celebration now seemed to close in, with each family member feeling the strain of the life they led. It wasn't just business that caused the tension within the Lemp family. Their personal lives became more complex as well. Marriages were strained, and secrets began to seep into their once tightly knit circle. While the family presented an image of unity and strength to the world, cracks had begun to show, and those cracks, though small at first, would only widen with time. The mansion, once a symbol of their unshakable success, began to feel different. Some visitors reported feeling a strange unease within its walls, a coldness that hadn't been there before. Whispers of odd happenings in the mansion's many rooms began circulating among the household staff, and a heavy atmosphere seemed to settle over the home, though no one could quite place what was wrong. Despite the growing tensions, the Lemp family pressed on, maintaining their public image as best they could. The mansion continued to host extravagant parties, and the brewery, though facing more competition, remained a powerful force in the industry. Yet behind the scenes, the weight of the family's struggles, both personal and professional, was becoming harder to bear. The mansion, with its sprawling rooms and hidden corridors, seemed to take on a life of its own. Some believed that the mansion was beginning to reflect the family's inner turmoil. The servants whispered among themselves about seeing shadows that moved when no one was there, or hearing strange noises late at night. The atmosphere within the mansion grew darker, though outwardly the family remained as poised and powerful as ever. As the new century approached, the world around the Lemp family was changing, and so were they. The mansion, once the site of so much joy and celebration, had become a place of sorrow and secrets. Even those closest to the family could sense that something was amiss, though no one could quite explain it. For now, the Lemp family continued to hold on to their empire, and the mansion remained a symbol of their wealth and success. But beneath the surface, the cracks were widening, and it would not be long before the weight of their struggles became too much to bear. As the 20th century dawned, the Lemp family's fortune seemed more precarious than ever. Inside the mansion that had once symbolized their power and prestige, tensions simmered and began to surface. It was no longer just the brewing industry's growing competition that troubled the family. Personal struggles and unresolved conflicts weighed heavily on each of its members, causing fractures that would soon become irreparable. William Lemp Sr., who had inherited the empire from his father, was no longer the vibrant and dynamic leader he had once been. Though the Lemp Brewery still operated with great success, William Sr. found himself increasingly burdened by the pressures of running a business in an ever-changing landscape. The death of his beloved son, Frederick, had shattered his resolve and left him reeling. Frederick, once seen as the future of the Lemp legacy, had died unexpectedly, and the loss had struck the family like a thunderclap. The emptiness left behind could not be filled by business success, and the mansion, which had once bustled with activity, now echoed with silence and grief. Frederick's passing marked the beginning of the family's tragic decline. William Sr., devastated by the loss, began to retreat further into himself. His once sharp business acumen dulled, and the brewery, which had been the pride of the Lemp family, began to suffer from his lack of leadership. The weight of his sorrow was felt by everyone in the mansion, where even the grandest rooms seemed to dim under the strain of his melancholy. William Jr., who had always felt the shadow of his father looming over him, now found himself thrust into the position of leading the family business. But where his father had once commanded respect and authority, William Jr. struggled to keep the brewery afloat. The booming industry that had once elevated the Lemp family to greatness was now crowded with fierce competitors, and William Jr. lacked the motivation and vision to innovate. Instead, he sought solace elsewhere, distracting himself from the pressures of leadership with a lavish lifestyle that further distanced him from the responsibilities he was supposed to inherit. The grand parties that had once filled the mansion with life continued, but they no longer carried the same sense of celebration. William Jr., known for his extravagant tastes and indulgences, turned the mansion into a place of excess. Behind the walls of the once revered estate, he hosted opulent gatherings, where the city's elite would drink and socialize long into the night. But these parties were not enough to mask the growing tensions within the family. The once thriving brewery was now in danger, and with each passing year, William Jr.'s grip on the business and his life grew weaker. The family's financial struggles soon mirrored their emotional ones. The weight of Frederick's death lingered, affecting not just William Sr., but his wife and surviving children. Relationships strained, with arguments erupting over the smallest matters, and whispers of secrets began to spread through the mansion. The grandeur of the Lemp estate became a prison for its inhabitants, and the walls that had once sheltered them from the outside world now seemed to close in, trapping them in their own misery. The brewery, once a symbol of progress and innovation, fell victim to poor management and bad investments. Prohibition was on the horizon, and the looming threat of a nationwide ban on alcohol only added to the family's anxiety. For a family that had built its legacy on the sale of beer, the future appeared bleak. As competition stiffened and the family's fortune dwindled, the Lemps faced the terrifying reality that their empire was crumbling. William Sr.'s health, both physical and mental, began to deteriorate. His once commanding presence in the mansion faded, and soon he was seen less frequently by the staff and family. The vibrant man who had built the Lemp dynasty from the ground up was now a shadow of his former self, withdrawing into the privacy of his mansion's hidden corridors. He spent his days secluded in his private quarters, rarely interacting with the outside world, and his decline cast a long shadow over the rest of the family. The mansion itself began to take on a different aura, one that reflected the inner turmoil of its residents. The once pristine halls felt darker, colder, as though the very air had thickened with sorrow. Servants who had once been proud to work in the prestigious Lemp all now whispered among themselves about strange happenings in the night footsteps where no one walked. Voices in empty rooms, and an unsettling sense of being watched. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the mansion itself had absorbed the grief and despair of its inhabitants. As William Sr.'s isolation deepened, his son, William Jr., attempted to keep the brewery afloat, but the pressure was too much for him. He too began to unravel. His personal life, already marked by indulgence and excess, spiraled out of control. The strain of running a failing business, coupled with the family's mounting emotional burdens, became more than he could handle. Though he continued to host parties and maintain appearances, those closest to him could see that the weight of the Lemp legacy was crushing him. The Lemp mansion, once a symbol of the family's success and prosperity, now stood as a haunting reminder of what had been lost. The walls that had witnessed their rise to power now bore silent witness to their fall. It was no longer a home, but a relic of a fading dynasty, filled with memories that seemed to linger like ghosts in every room. And it was in those darkened halls, where grief, loss, and despair had taken root, that the first whispers of something more sinister began to surface. Visitors to the mansion, once eager to see the opulence of the Lemp estate, now reported feeling a heavy, oppressive presence as they walked through its rooms. Some spoke of hearing faint whispers, while others claimed to see fleeting shadows moving in the corners of their vision. The mansion that had once been alive with celebration was now eerily still, a place where the weight of the past could be felt in every corner. The Lemp family, once revered, had become a tragic tale whispered in St. Louis, a cautionary story of what happens when success turns to ruin. The mansion stood, a monument to their fall, and as the family's influence faded, the once glorious home became something else, entirely a place where memories of the past were not just remembered, but lived. The Lemp mansion, once a beacon of luxury and prosperity, now stood as a silent sentinel to the family's tragic history. After the passing of the last of the original Lemp heirs, the once vibrant home was largely abandoned, its grand rooms left to gather dust, the echoes of past laughter replaced by an eerie quiet. But it wasn't long before that quiet began to feel unnatural. Rumors of strange occurrences started to seep out from the few who remained near the mansion. At first, it was subtle, the sound of soft footsteps pacing through the empty halls, the occasional flicker of lights when no one was around, doors that seemed to close on their own. The mansion staff, those who had once served the Lemp family loyally, whispered among themselves about the unsettling events. But for a time, these occurrences were brushed aside as the natural creaks and groans of an old house. Yet, as the days turned into months, the phenomena became harder to ignore. The first major event occurred one stormy night. A caretaker, who had been hired to look after the mansion in its abandonment, was alone in the house when he heard the unmistakable sound of a piano playing. Startled, he made his way to the parlor, where the grand piano had been left untouched for years. As he entered the room, the music abruptly stopped, and he found the piano's lid wide open, keys still vibrating from the pressure of invisible fingers. He quickly left the room, convinced he had simply imagined it. But the next morning, the piano's keys were found pressed down in a strange, deliberate pattern, as though someone or something had been playing in the dead of night. Word spread quickly about the strange occurrences, and soon after, more reports began to emerge. Visitors to the mansion, including those drawn to its eerie history, would describe feeling an inexplicable chill as they stepped through the front doors. Some claimed to feel a sudden, overwhelming sadness, as though the very air inside the mansion was heavy with despair. But the most disturbing reports came from those who ventured into the basement, an area of the house that had long been associated with dark rumors. The basement of the Lemp mansion had always carried an air of mystery. During the height of the brewery's success, it had housed storage rooms and tunnels that connected the mansion to the brewery. But as the family's fortunes fell, so too did the use of these spaces, and they were largely abandoned. Those brave enough to explore the basement spoke of hearing disembodied whispers in the dark and the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. Several even claimed to see fleeting figures in the shadows, figures that would disappear the moment they were approached. One particularly unsettling encounter involved a group of paranormal enthusiasts who had been granted permission to investigate the mansion. They spent hours exploring the upper floors without incident, but as soon as they descended into the basement, their equipment began to malfunction. Cameras that had been working perfectly minutes earlier shut off unexpectedly, and their audio recorders picked up strange, low voices that none of them had heard at the time. One investigator, after standing alone in a corner for several minutes, suddenly felt a cold hand brush against her arm, though no one else was near her. Terrified, the group quickly left the basement, but when they reviewed their footage later, they discovered several seconds of static, followed by the faint sound of laughter that none of them could explain. The most disturbing part of the mansion, however, was not the basement or even the grand rooms upstairs. It was a small, unremarkable room tucked away on the second floor. This room, often referred to as the servants' quarters, was where many claimed to feel the strongest presence. Those who entered the room would often report feeling lightheaded or dizzy. On more than one occasion, visitors claimed they could hear the sound of someone weeping softly, though the room was empty. As more people visited the Lemp mansion, stories of hauntings began to pile up. Shadows that moved of their own accord, objects that disappeared and reappeared in different locations, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched became common experiences for those who spent time in the mansion. While some skeptics dismissed these stories as nothing more than overactive imaginations, others insisted that something unexplainable was happening within the walls of the mansion. Local paranormal investigators were soon drawn to the Lemp mansion, eager to uncover the truth behind the hauntings. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence came from an investigation conducted by a well-known ghost hunting team. After spending several nights in the mansion, they captured what appeared to be a figure standing at the end of a hallway. The figure was dressed in period clothing and seemed to vanish as the camera approached. The team, though seasoned in dealing with such phenomena, was stunned by the clarity of the apparition, and the footage quickly made its rounds through paranormal circles, cementing the mansion's reputation as one of the most haunted locations in America. But while investigators came and went, the strange happenings continued. Guests who stayed overnight in the mansion's converted bed and breakfast reported waking up to the sound of someone knocking on their door, only to find no one outside. Others described feeling pressure on the bed, as though someone had sat down beside them while they slept. The once grand home had become a place of restless spirits, unable or unwilling to leave the site of their past. Yet, For all the reports of ghostly encounters, there was one apparition that seemed to appear more frequently than any other. A man in a dark suit, often seen standing near the mansion's grand staircase. Those who saw him described a tall, imposing figure, his face obscured in shadow, who would disappear the moment anyone tried to approach. Some believed this to be the spirit of William Lemp Sr., forever tied to the home that had both made and destroyed his family. As the hauntings grew in frequency, the legend of the Lemp Mansion spread far beyond the borders of St. Louis. It became a destination for those fascinated by the paranormal, a place where people went not just to learn about the Lemp family's tragic history, but to experience the otherworldly for themselves. And though many left the mansion with stories of strange occurrences, few could explain what was truly happening within its walls. The mansion had become more than just a relic of the past. It had become a living embodiment of the family's legacy, haunted not only by the spirits of those who once lived there, but by the weight of their history. The Lemp family may have fallen, but their presence in the mansion remained, lingering in the shadows, waiting for the next person to stumble upon their story. With stories of eerie encounters and strange happenings surrounding the Lemp Mansion, it wasn't long before paranormal investigators and curious skeptics flocked to the grand old house. What began as whispered rumors among locals had become a national sensation, and those with a thirst for the supernatural sought to uncover the truth behind the hauntings. One of the first major investigations into the Lemp Mansion was conducted by a renowned team of paranormal experts. Equipped with state-of-the-art technology, they set out to capture evidence of the spirits said to roam the mansion's halls. Cameras were set up in every room, voice recorders placed in dark corners, and infrared sensors lined the hallways in an attempt to detect anything out of the ordinary. For the investigators, the goal was not just to prove the mansion was haunted, but to make contact with whatever or whoever was still there. On the first night of the investigation, the team gathered in the mansion's parlor. They sat in silence as the house creaked around them, the soft hum of their recording devices filling the stillness. After several hours of waiting, one of the investigators reported hearing a faint voice from the direction of the staircase. The team scrambled to check their equipment, and sure enough, the audio recorder had picked up what sounded like a soft whisper, a voice that seemed to say, "Why are you here?" Encouraged by this small piece of evidence, the team pressed on, moving room by room throughout the mansion. The second-floor bedroom, where guests had frequently reported the sensation of someone sitting on the bed, was of particular interest. As they set up their equipment, the air in the room grew noticeably colder. One of the investigators, who was sitting quietly on the edge of the bed, suddenly felt the mattress depress beside her, as though someone had sat down. She froze, glancing around at her team, but no one else had moved. What was that? She whispered, her voice shaking slightly. The others watched as a faint imprint remained in the mattress, visible even after she stood up. Cameras caught the entire event, and though they had no explanation for what had caused it, the team could not deny the experience was real. As the night wore on, the team continued to document strange occurrences. Footsteps were heard in the hallways, but when they rushed to check, no one was there. The motion sensors in the basement were triggered repeatedly, though the cameras showed only empty corridors. And in the servants' quarters, one investigator felt a sudden chill and described feeling a presence standing directly behind him. Though when he turned, the room was empty. The basement, long considered one of the most unsettling parts of the mansion, proved to be a hotbed of activity. As they ventured into its depths, the investigators couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Several of them reported hearing low voices echoing through the narrow tunnels that once connected the mansion to the brewery. One particularly brave investigator stood alone in the basement for several minutes, only to hear what he described as the sound of heavy breathing coming from the far end of the room. When he called out, asking if anyone was there, the breathing stopped, but the sense of being watched lingered. The team returned to the mansion for several nights, hoping to gather more evidence. Each night, the activity seemed to increase. Disembodied voices, cold spots, and objects moving on their own became almost routine. But the most shocking moment came on their final night, when they attempted to make direct contact with the spirits through a series of questions. Using a device designed to pick up electromagnetic frequencies, the investigators asked if anyone was present and invited the spirit to make itself known. For several long moments, there was silence. Then, without warning, the device spiked, its lights flashing brightly as the needle jumped. The team looked at one another, excitement mixed with a growing sense of unease. They asked another question. "Are you one of the Lemp family?" The device remained still for a moment, then spiked again. The team pressed on, asking if the spirit had a message for them. This time, instead of a response from their equipment, they all heard a distinct knock coming from the far wall. They rushed to investigate, but once again, they found no one there. As word of these investigations spread, more and more paranormal enthusiasts descended on the Lemp Mansion, each hoping to capture their own piece of evidence. Some brought cutting-edge equipment, while others relied on nothing more than their instincts. Time and time again, those who entered the mansion came away with similar stories, strange noises, cold spots, and the overwhelming sense that they were not alone. One particularly striking piece of evidence came from a solo investigator who spent a night in the mansion's infamous second-floor bedroom. Armed with only a camera and a digital recorder, she sat on the edge of the bed, asking questions to the empty room. For hours, nothing happened. But as she reviewed the footage later, she noticed something chilling, what appeared to be a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, just out of focus. The figure didn't move, but it was clearly there, watching. Despite these numerous accounts, the most famous apparition tied to the Lemp Mansion remained the mysterious figure near the grand staircase. Several investigators and guests alike claimed to see him tall, dressed in a dark suit and standing still at the top of the stairs as though waiting for someone. Yet when approached, he would vanish. Some believed this to be the spirit of William Lemp Sr., tied forever to the mansion where his legacy had crumbled. As more and more evidence of the supernatural piled up, the Lemp Mansion's reputation as a haunted hotspot was cemented. It became not only a destination for paranormal investigators, but also for those simply curious about the house's dark history. Tours were offered, allowing visitors to walk through the mansion's eerie halls, and those brave enough could even stay the night, though few ever left without their own stories of strange encounters. Despite all the investigations, all the footage, and all the personal experiences, one question remained unanswered. Why were the spirits still there? Was it the tragic history of the Lemp family that bound them to the house, unable to move on? Or was the mansion itself, with its hidden rooms and dark corners, a beacon for the supernatural, drawing spirits from beyond? No one could say for certain, but those who stepped inside the mansion knew one thing: they were never truly alone. The Lemp Mansion, now infamous for its haunted history, had transformed into something far beyond a once grand family estate. Over the years, as more investigators, tourists, and thrill-seekers visited its halls, the mansion took on a new life as a paranormal landmark. It became a place where the past and the present seemed to intersect, where the line between history and the supernatural blurred, and where visitors came not only to witness its architecture, but to experience the inexplicable. In the years following the countless investigations and ghost hunts, the mansion's reputation as one of the most haunted places in America continued to grow. People from all over the country, and even the world, sought out the mansion, driven by a desire to connect with the spirits said to linger within its walls. Stories of ghost sightings, cold spots, strange noises, and objects moving on their own became almost commonplace. but they never lost their grip on the public's imagination. As the mansion's fame grew, so too did the fascination with the Lemp family itself. The tragic rise and fall of the Lemp dynasty became a central piece of American folklore, with the family's history serving as a cautionary tale of how great success can lead to immense suffering. Documentaries, books, and articles chronicling the family's story were produced, each one exploring the complex lives of the Lemps and the events that had ultimately led to the mansion's haunted reputation. Yet, for all the stories of paranormal activity, there was also a deep sense of sadness that seemed to linger over the house. Visitors often remarked that while the mansion was undoubtedly haunted, the spirits that resided there didn't feel malicious. Instead, many felt that the entities were lost or stuck, trapped in the home they had once cherished, but were now unable to leave. The tragedy of the Lemp family's downfall seemed to hang in the air, and many believed that the hauntings were not so much a sign of anger or resentment, but of unresolved pain. As the mansion became a popular attraction, it was also converted into a bed and breakfast, allowing guests to stay overnight and experience the house's eerie atmosphere for themselves. Those who spent the night often left with stories of strange occurrences, footsteps pacing in the hallways, the sensation of someone sitting on the edge of their bed, or the feeling of being watched while standing in front of the grand staircase. Some even claimed to have seen the now famous figure at the top of the stairs, a man in the dark suit, thought to be William Lemp Sr., keeping watch over the home he had once ruled. For many, staying at the Lemp mansion was an opportunity to confront the unknown. But while some arrived in hopes of a supernatural encounter, others were drawn by a different kind of curiosity, the desire to understand the complex legacy of the Lemp family. The mansion, in many ways, had become a monument to their history, a living museum where guests could walk through the very rooms that had once housed some of the most influential people in St. Louis. The grand dining room, the elegant parlors, the servants' quarters, each space was filled with artifacts of the past, reminding visitors of the lives that had been lived and lost within those walls. Though the mansion had undergone renovations over the years to accommodate guests, great care was taken to preserve its historical integrity. The rooms were restored to reflect the time when the Lemps had lived there, giving visitors a glimpse into the opulence of their world. Yet, even with these efforts, the house maintained its unsettling aura. The weight of the past was ever present, and guests often reported feeling an inexplicable sadness, as though the walls themselves remembered the pain that had been endured within them. As the Lemp mansion became more integrated into local and national culture, it also became a part of St. Louis folklore. Locals, who had grown up hearing stories of the mansion's haunted past, often shared their own experiences, adding to the growing list of supernatural events associated with the house. Some believed that the hauntings were tied to specific members of the Lemp family, while others thought that the house itself had become a kind of portal, attracting spirits from beyond. The mansion's presence in popular culture was cemented when it became the subject of numerous television shows and paranormal documentaries. Each program delved into the house's rich history, exploring both the family's tragic legacy and the mysterious events that continued to occur there. For many, these shows were the first glimpse into the world of the Lemp mansion, and they helped fuel a new wave of interest in the house, bringing even more visitors to its doors. Despite its transformation into a tourist destination, the Lemp mansion never lost its sense of mystery. Even those who had spent years studying the house, whether as historians, paranormal investigators, or curious visitors, agreed that there was something about the mansion that defied explanation. The stories of ghostly encounters and strange happenings were consistent, yet elusive, leaving more questions than answers. The spirits, it seemed, were content to remain just out of reach, revealing themselves only in fleeting moments. Over time, the mansion became a symbol not just of the Lemp family's downfall, but of the enduring presence of the past. It was a place where history refused to stay buried, where the echoes of old tragedies continued to resonate. For many, this was the true legacy of the Lemp Mansion, a reminder that even in the face of immense success, there can be deep and lasting sorrow. Yet, despite the house's haunted reputation, the Lemp Mansion remained a place where people sought connection. Whether it was with the spirits that roamed its halls or with the history that shaped its walls, visitors continued to come year after year, drawn by the inexplicable pull of the mansion. Some came for the thrill of a supernatural encounter, while others came to pay their respects to a family whose story had become legend. In the end, the Lemp Mansion was more than just a haunted house. It was a living testament to the resilience of memory, a place where the past refused to fade. And for those who walked through its doors, it was a reminder that the line between this world and the next might be thinner than we think. As visitors continue to flock to the Lemp Mansion, they do so with the knowledge that they are stepping into a space that holds more than just history. The spirits of the Lemp family may still linger, but their presence is not one of fear, it is one of remembrance. The mansion, in all its haunted glory, stands as a bridge between the past and the present, a place where the story is never truly over. The Myrtles Plantation, nestled in the deep south of Louisiana, stands as a relic of an era long past, an architectural monument woven with tales of mystery and tragedy. Its majestic oak trees, draped with moss, form an eerie canopy over the estate, a picturesque yet haunting sight. But beneath its serene facade lies a history soaked in sorrow, conflict, and unsettling events that would ultimately birth one of the most famous haunted sites in America. Built in 1796 by General David Bradford, a prominent figure involved in the Whiskey Rebellion, the Myrtles Plantation was initially named Laurel Grove. Bradford, fleeing from Pennsylvania after his involvement in the rebellion, sought refuge in the dense Louisiana wilderness. The isolation of the plantation gave him the safety he needed while living as a fugitive, and soon, Laurel Grove became his retreat from the law. Bradford lived quietly, cultivating his land and maintaining a relatively peaceful existence away from the conflicts that had defined much of his early life. However, this peace was short-lived. After receiving a presidential pardon, Bradford was able to resume his life in the public eye. He brought his family to the plantation, expanding it into a larger, more profitable estate. The plantation thrived in the early 1800s, largely due to the labor of enslaved people who worked tirelessly on the land. As was the case with many southern plantations, the prosperity of the Myrtles was built upon the backs of those enslaved, whose names and lives were often erased from history. While the wealth of the estate grew, so did the darker undercurrents that would later manifest in tragic ways. David Bradford's daughter, Sarah Matilda, would eventually marry Judge Clark Woodruff, a man whose influence and ambition brought further success to the plantation. However, prosperity did not shield the Myrtles from the tragedies that awaited. Sarah and Clark's 3 children would not escape the dark fate that loomed over the estate. The Woodruffs faced unspeakable heartbreak, with 2 of their children passing at a young age, casting a shadow over what had once been a place of refuge. The loss of the children marked the beginning of what some believe was the plantation's descent into despair. At the time, life in the South was harsh, with diseases such as yellow fever and cholera sweeping through the region, claiming countless lives. The Woodruff family, despite their status, was not immune to these grim realities. But it wasn't just illness that led to the sorrow surrounding the Myrtles plantation. The 19th century was rife with conflict, and as the tensions between the North and South grew, so too did the unrest within the plantation itself. The enslaved individuals who worked on the estate lived under brutal conditions, and their suffering, though largely hidden from the official records, added to the mounting darkness that seemed to envelop the land. By the time of the Civil War, the plantation was no longer under the ownership of the Bradford Woodruff family, having changed hands multiple times. However, the conflicts of the era did not spare the Myrtles from further tragedy. During the war, the plantation was reportedly looted by Union soldiers, who left behind even more devastation in their wake. The once thriving estate became a place of ruin, and the stories of suffering only grew. As the South struggled to rebuild in the years following the Civil War, the Myrtles plantation stood as a symbol of both the old world and the new. Reconstruction brought changes to the region, but the ghost of the past, both figuratively and literally, continued to linger in the halls of the plantation. The violence and pain endured during those years left an indelible mark on the land, one that many believe gave rise to the paranormal activity that would later make the Myrtles famous. Though often overlooked in the retelling of the Myrtles plantation's history, the lives of the enslaved people who lived and worked on the estate cannot be ignored. Their stories, full of pain and hardship, are integral to understanding the atmosphere of unrest that pervaded the plantation. While the legends of ghosts and spirits dominate the modern narrative, the real lives of these individuals form the tragic foundation upon which these tales were built. Slavery on the plantation was a brutal reality. Those who worked the land endured long hours of hard labor, abuse, and an existence defined by oppression. The names of most of these individuals have been lost to time, but their suffering remains a key part of the Myrtles' tragic history. Many believe that the unrest of the enslaved continues to manifest in the paranormal occurrences that have been reported over the years. By the late 1800s, the Myrtles plantation had undergone several more ownership changes, each bringing new stories and new tragedies. It was during this period that the legends of hauntings truly began to take hold. Visitors to the estate started reporting strange sightings, from ghostly apparitions to unexplained noises in the night. These early accounts were often dismissed as superstition, yet the stories persisted. The plantation's dark history, coupled with its eerie atmosphere, made it fertile ground for tales of the supernatural. Over time, the Myrtles plantation's reputation as a haunted site grew, attracting both skeptics and believers alike. The plantation itself, despite its beauty and historical significance, seemed forever shrouded in a sense of unease. The land, once a symbol of prosperity, had become a place where past and present collided, with the stories of those who had suffered there refusing to fade away. Of all the eerie tales that have come to define the haunted legacy of the Myrtles plantation, none is as famous or as chilling as the story of Chloe. The legend of Chloe, an enslaved woman who lived and worked on the plantation, weaves together themes of betrayal, fear, and ultimately, tragedy. Over the years, her story has taken on a life of its own, immortalizing her as one of the most well-known spirits said to haunt the grounds. The legend begins with Chloe's arrival at the Myrtles plantation, though the details of how she came to be there have been lost to time. Some say Chloe was brought to the estate as a young woman, while others claim she had been there for years. What all versions of the story agree on is that Chloe worked inside the main house, serving as a maid to the plantation owner's family. By this point, Judge Clark Woodruff had taken over the estate after marrying David Bradford's daughter, Sarah Matilda. Chloe was said to be a trusted servant, one who had gained a degree of favor within the household. She was responsible for attending to the personal needs of the family, often assisting with the children. However, it is here that the story takes a darker turn, as rumors began to swirl about Chloe's relationship with Judge Woodruff. One of the most pervasive elements of Chloe's tale is the suggestion of an affair between her and the judge. Some versions of the story claim that Chloe had been coerced into the relationship, fearing for her safety and her position within the household. Other tellings paint a more ambiguous picture, with Chloe using her knowledge of the judge's personal life to her advantage, attempting to secure her place within the estate. Regardless of the exact nature of the relationship, the affair eventually came to light. According to legend, when Sarah Matilda discovered Chloe's involvement with her husband, she responded with anger and retribution. Fearing for her life, Chloe began to eavesdrop on the family's private conversations, hoping to learn what fate awaited her. In some accounts, Chloe was caught listening at a keyhole, an act that led to her being punished. It was during this time that Chloe's story took its most tragic and fateful turn. Chloe's fear of being cast out or punished escalated, leading her to make a desperate and disastrous decision. In an attempt to regain favor with the family, Chloe devised a plan to sicken them, hoping she could later provide the cure and earn their gratitude. She baked a cake, lacing it with a toxic substance thought to be oleander leaves. The plan went horribly wrong. Instead of a mild illness, Sarah Matilda and two of her children fell gravely ill after eating the poisoned cake. Within days, they had passed away, their sudden death shrouding the plantation in grief. Chloe, realizing the enormity of her mistake, was consumed with panic. The household was thrown into mourning, and Chloe's role in the tragedy was quickly discovered. Whether through her own confession or a suspicion of others, the outcome was inevitable. The aftermath of the poisoning was swift and brutal. The other enslaved individuals on the plantation, fearful of the consequences that might befall them all, took matters into their own hands. According to legend, Chloe was dragged into the yard and, in a desperate act of self-preservation, was executed by hanging. Her body was then disposed of, cast into the nearby Mississippi River, her life extinguished in a moment of collective fury. But the story of Chloe did not end with her death. Over the years, her spirit has been said to linger at the Myrtles plantation, an enduring presence tied to the tragedy she had a hand in causing. The legend of Chloe's ghost began shortly after her passing. Visitors and residents of the plantation reported seeing a figure of a woman dressed in a green turban, standing quietly in the shadows of the house. Her apparition would often appear near the spot where she had once stood as a servant, and her face haunted and sorrowful was a reminder of the events that had unfolded there. Many believe that Chloe's spirit has remained tethered to the Myrtles as a result of the violent and unjust manner of her death. She is often described as a restless ghost, one whose presence can be felt in both the light of day and the dead of night. Some claim to have seen her peering through windows, her eyes filled with regret, while others have heard the faint sound of footsteps trailing through the halls, always near the rooms where the poisoning took place. One of the most famous pieces of evidence supporting the existence of Chloe's ghost is a photograph taken in the 1990s. In the image, a figure that resembles Chloe can be seen standing between two buildings, dressed in a long skirt and a headscarf. The photo has been widely debated, with some dismissing it as a trick of the light, while others insist it is proof of the supernatural. Over time, Chloe's legend has grown, with many retellings casting her as a symbol of regret and the consequences of poor choices. Her story, while rooted in tragedy, is also a cautionary tale, one that warns of the dangers of manipulation and betrayal. But for May, Chloe is more than just a ghostly figure. She represents the unresolved tensions of the past, particularly the injustices faced by enslaved individuals like her. While the details of Chloe's life and the events leading to her death remain murky, the power of her story lies in its ability to capture the imagination. It serves as a reminder of the human toll of the era's harsh realities, where lives were often defined by fear and desperation. In recent years, historians and paranormal investigators have tried to separate fact from fiction when it comes to Chloe's story. Some have suggested that there is no historical record of an enslaved woman named Chloe, nor any evidence that Sarah Matilda and her children died of poisoning. Instead, they argue, the family may have succumbed to one of the many illnesses that plagued the South during that time. Yet, the lack of historical documentation has done little to diminish the legend. The story of Chloe, whether grounded in truth or folklore, remains a key part of the Myrtles Plantation's haunted legacy. Her ghost is one of the most frequently reported spirits on the property, and many who visit the plantation still claim to feel her presence. In the end, Chloe's tale is one of the most enduring aspects of the Myrtles Plantation, a story passed down through generations, shaping the reputation of the estate as a place where the past continues to walk among the living. The Myrtles Plantation is not just a historic landmark. It is a place where the past feels unsettlingly close. Over the years, countless visitors, residents, and staff have reported encounters with the unexplained. Whether it's the soft sound of footsteps echoing through empty halls, a sudden chill in the air, or full-bodied apparitions appearing in broad daylight, the plantation's haunted reputation is built upon years of strange and eerie events. The supernatural experiences at Myrtles span generations, drawing believers and skeptics alike to its haunted halls. Those who spend time at the Myrtles Plantation often report that the house feels as if it is never truly empty. From the moment one steps onto the creaking wooden floors, there is a palpable sense of being watched, an invisible presence lingering just out of sight. This feeling has been described by both guests and employees of the plantation, many of whom had no prior knowledge of the estate's haunted history when they arrived. The apparitions seen at the Myrtles vary widely, ranging from faint outlines to fully formed figures. The most common sightings are that of Chloe, whose spirit is said to still roam the grounds. But Chloe is not the only ghost who haunts the plantation. Numerous other spirits have been seen and felt by visitors, each with its own story tied to the tragic past of the estate. One of the most frequently told ghost stories revolves around the spirits of two young girls, believed to be the children of Judge Clark Woodruff and Sarah Matilda. After their tragic deaths, many believe their souls never left the Myrtles. Guests have reported seeing the ghostly figures of children playing in the hallways, laughing softly as they run through the house. Some have even claimed to hear their faint voices at night, calling out to each other or to their long-departed mother. In one chilling account, a guest staying in one of the upstairs bedrooms awoke to the sound of giggling, only to find the figures of two small girls standing at the foot of the bed. The figures vanished as soon as the guest sat up, leaving behind a cold spot that lingered long after the encounter. Others have reported hearing the sound of children's footsteps in rooms that were supposed to be empty. These apparitions are not confined to the inside of the house. Many have reported seeing the children playing in the garden, their dresses billowing in the breeze as they move about the grounds. The sightings of these young girls serve as a haunting reminder of the family's tragic loss, and they are often seen as benevolent spirits, their presence more sorrowful than malevolent. One of the most well-known supernatural objects at the Myrtles Plantation is a large, ornate mirror that hangs in the main hallway. According to legend, this mirror holds the spirits of Sarah Matilda and her children, trapped within its reflective surface after their deaths. In the years since, visitors have reported seeing strange, ghostly images appear in the mirror handprints, faces, and figures that seem to press up against the glass as if trying to escape. It is said that despite frequent cleanings, handprints reappear on the mirror, always in the same spots. Some guests have even claimed to see Sarah Matilda's face staring back at them from the mirror, her expression filled with grief. This haunting relic has become one of the plantation's most famous supernatural attractions, and many who visit the Myrtles make it a point to take a closer look, hoping to catch a glimpse of the otherworldly figures rumored to be trapped inside. The Myrtles Plantation is also home to a mysterious piano that seems to have a life of its own. Late at night, when the house is quiet and still, the sound of music can sometimes be heard drifting through the air. Guests and staff have reported hearing the piano's keys being played, even when no one is near it. The melody is often described as soft and melancholy, a ghostly tune that echoes through the otherwise silent house. In some instances, the piano has been seen moving on its own, with the lid slowly lifting and falling as if someone were about to play. Guests who have stayed in rooms near the parlor have been awakened by the eerie sound of the piano playing faintly in the distance. Upon investigation, they find the room empty and the piano undisturbed. This mysterious phenomenon has baffled visitors and paranormal investigators alike, with no clear explanation for why the piano continues to play on its own. Some believe it is the work of one of the many spirits who roam the plantation, perhaps a former resident who enjoyed playing music in life and continues to do so in death. The grand staircase of the Myrtles plantation is a focal point for many paranormal encounters. One of the most frequently seen spirits is that of a woman dressed in antebellum attire, often described as wearing a long, flowing dress. She is most often seen descending the stairs, her hand lightly brushing the banister as she moves silently downward. Guests have reported seeing this apparition both during the day and at night, though she never acknowledges their presence. She seems to be in her own world, reliving a moment from long ago. Some believe this woman is the ghost of Sarah Matilda, forever bound to the house where she met such a tragic fate. Others think she may be a former resident or even a visitor from another era. The sightings of this spectral figure are so frequent that many employees have become accustomed to seeing her out of the corner of their eye, only to look up and find her gone. Her presence is not considered threatening, but rather a sad, silent reminder of the plantation's haunted past. In addition to the sightings of full-bodied apparitions, visitors to the Myrtles plantation frequently report hearing unexplained noises throughout the house. Footsteps are often heard on the upper floors when no one is there, and doors are known to open and close on their own. Disembodied voices, often faint and unintelligible, have been reported in the hallways and bedrooms, as if the spirits of the plantation are continuing their conversations from another time. Shadows, too, seem to move on their own within the house. Guests have described seeing dark, human-shaped figures darting across the walls, only to disappear when approached. These shadows are often seen in the corners of rooms or at the end of hallways, adding to the sense that the Myrtles is a place where the past refuses to stay buried. Another spirit that reportedly haunts the plantation is that of a Confederate soldier. Visitors have seen the figure of a man in a gray uniform walking the grounds, his face stern and focused. He's often seen near the front of the house or by the plantation's gates, as if standing guard. Some believe this spirit may be a remnant from the Civil War, when the Myrtles was looted by Union soldiers. The soldier has never been known to interact with visitors, disappearing as quickly as he is seen. His presence, though fleeting, adds to the eerie atmosphere of the plantation, reminding guests of the many lives that have passed through the estate over the centuries. Over the years, the Myrtles plantation has attracted numerous paranormal investigators, ghost hunters, and curious tourists hoping to document the supernatural. One of the most famous pieces of evidence to come from the plantation is a photograph taken in the 1990s. The image shows what appears to be the figure of a woman standing between two buildings on the property. Dressed in old-fashioned clothing, the figure bears a striking resemblance to the descriptions of Chloe, the plantation's most famous ghost. This photo has been widely analyzed and debated, with some believing it to be undeniable proof of the Myrtles' haunted nature, while others dismiss it as a trick of the light or a case of mistaken identity. Regardless of the explanation, the photo has become a symbol of the supernatural activity at the plantation, drawing even more attention to its ghostly reputation. The Myrtles plantation's reputation as one of America's most haunted locations has attracted paranormal investigators, ghost hunters, and curious thrill seekers for decades. With so many stories of ghostly encounters, strange happenings, and eerie sounds, it was only a matter of time before modern technology was employed to try to capture proof of the supernatural. This chapter delves into the various investigations that have taken place at the plantation and the chilling experiences reported by visitors in recent years. The paranormal interest in Myrtle's plantation grew steadily throughout the 20th century, particularly as stories of Chloe and other apparitions circulated more widely. As television shows focusing on hauntings and the paranormal began to gain popularity in the 1990s and early 2000s, the plantation became a frequent subject of investigation. Numerous paranormal teams have visited the site, bringing with them advanced equipment in the hopes of documenting the mysterious occurrences the visitors have been reporting for generations. These investigations have often yielded unsettling results, from eerie audio recordings to unexplained video footage. The plantation has been featured on several high-profile paranormal television shows, which have further cemented its status as a ghost hunting hotspot. However, despite the many investigations, the question remains, are the spirits of the Myrtles real, or are they the product of vivid imaginations and heightened emotions? One of the most commonly reported forms of evidence at the Myrtles plantation is the capture of EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, unexplained sounds or voices that are typically recorded but not heard by the human ear at the time. Investigators have claimed to capture chilling EVPs throughout the plantation, including voices that seem to respond directly to questions. In one investigation, an EVP was recorded in the main hallway near the infamous mirror. When asked if there were any spirits present, a faint voice can be heard whispering, "I'm here." Others have captured sounds of children laughing, which some believe to be the ghostly echoes of the Woodruff children who perished after the alleged poisoning. Many of these recordings are faint and difficult to interpret, but they add to the growing body of evidence that suggests the plantation is far from an ordinary historical site. Some investigators have also reported hearing disembodied voices during their time at the Myrtles. These voices, though not captured on recording devices, have been described as soft whispers, as if someone is speaking from a distant room. These auditory phenomena often occur in the late hours of the night when the house is quiet and empty, further adding to the eerie atmosphere. Another tool frequently used by paranormal investigators is the EMF, electromagnetic field detector, which measures fluctuations in electromagnetic energy. The theory behind its use in ghost hunting is that spirits may emit or disrupt electromagnetic fields, causing the devices to spike in areas where there is no obvious source of interference. At the Myrtles plantation, investigators have reported strange EMF readings, particularly around the staircase and in the bedrooms where many of the hauntings are said to occur. One investigation showed a sudden spike in EMF levels near the grand staircase, the very spot where the lady on the stairs has been seen. Despite thoroughly checking the area for any logical explanation, such as wiring or electronic devices, no cause for the sudden fluctuations was found. These readings are often cited as evidence that something paranormal is occurring, though skeptics argue that EMF spikes can be caused by a variety of natural sources. Still, the consistency with which these anomalies occur in specific areas of the house lends credence to the theory that the plantation is home to something otherworldly. Many visitors to the Myrtles plantation have reported seeing shadowy figures moving through the halls, often darting out of sight just as they are noticed. These shadow figures, sometimes described as human-shaped but featureless, have become a hallmark of the plantation's paranormal activity. Some investigators have captured these shadowy movements on video, though the footage is often grainy and difficult to interpret. In one famous instance, a team recorded what appeared to be a dark figure crossing the hallway, only to disappear into the wall. Upon reviewing the footage, no explanation for the figure could be found, leading many to believe that this was one of the plantation's many restless spirits. In addition to shadow figures, strange orbs of light have also been frequently reported. These orbs are often seen floating near the ceilings or drifting through rooms, their origins unknown. Some have speculated that these lights are manifestations of spirits, while others believe they may be caused by reflections or camera artifacts. Regardless of their cause, the lights add another layer of mystery to the already haunted reputation of the Myrtles. Even outside of official investigations, everyday visitors to the Myrtles plantation continue to report their own unsettling encounters. Some visitors have claimed to feel a sudden cold breeze pass by them, even when all the windows are closed. Others report feeling a distinct pressure on their chest, as though someone is standing too close, watching them. These sensations are often accompanied by a deep sense of unease, or the feeling that they are not alone, even in an empty room. A frequent experience recounted by guests is the sudden malfunction of electronic devices. Cameras and phones often drain unexpectedly, or photographs come out distorted. Some have even reported taking photos that reveal strange anomalies, lights, blurs, or misty figures that were not visible when the picture was taken. These technical disturbances have been attributed to the spirits of the plantation interfering with the devices. Those skeptics argue that these issues are likely due to the age of the building or environmental factors. One particularly eerie story involves a guest who stayed overnight in one of the plantation's rooms. In the early hours of the morning, they awoke to find the figure of a woman standing at the foot of their bed, her face hidden in the shadows. Believing it to be a member of the staff, the guest called out, only to see the figure slowly vanish into thin air. Needless to say, the guest did not sleep for the rest of the night. While the Myrtles plantation has earned its reputation as a paranormal hotspot, there are many who remain skeptical of the ghostly claims. Skeptics argue that many of the so-called paranormal experiences can be explained by natural causes. The age of the plantation, with its creaky floors and drafty rooms, may contribute to the eerie atmosphere. The strange noises and cold spots could be the result of the house settling or changes in air pressure, and the shadowy figures could simply be tricks of the light in the dimly lit halls. Some historians have also pointed out that much of the plantation's ghostly lore, particularly the story of Chloe, may be more legend than fact. There are no historical records that confirm Chloe's existence, and the Woodruff family's deaths, often attributed to poisoning, were likely caused by illness common in the 19th century South. Despite these efforts to debunk the hauntings, the stories continue to capture the imagination of those who visit. For every skeptic, there are countless others who leave the Myrtles plantation convinced they've experienced something unexplainable. Whether it's the power of suggestion, a heightened sense of awareness, or genuine encounters with the paranormal, the experiences of visitors contribute to the enduring legacy of the plantation as a place where the past feels all too close. Ultimately, the Myrtles plantation's haunted reputation is as much a part of its identity as its architectural beauty or historical significance. The ghost stories that have developed over the years, whether based in fact or fiction, have become an integral part of what draws people to this remote corner of Louisiana. Visitors arrive hoping to experience the supernatural for themselves, to walk the halls where the past seems to linger, and to maybe catch a glimpse of something beyond the ordinary. In this way, the Myrtles plantation is more than just a historic estate. It is a living legend. The stories of ghosts, mysterious occurrences, and tragic spirits have become entwined with the very fabric of the house, turning it into a place where history and folklore meet. The Myrtles plantation is not just a relic of Southern history, nor simply a famous haunted house. It's a place where the past, both historical and paranormal, intertwines with the present. Over the years, its reputation has grown from that of an ordinary historical estate to a site of intense public fascination, largely due to its chilling ghost stories and the mysterious aura that surrounds it. As the story of the Myrtles has evolved, so has its cultural significance. This chapter examines the lasting impact of the plantation's haunted history on its community, its visitors, and popular culture. The haunting of the Myrtles plantation has drawn thousands of visitors from around the world. What began as a historical curiosity has transformed into a major tourist destination, with people eager to experience the eerie charm of this plantation firsthand. The combination of history and the supernatural has made it one of the most visited and talked about haunted sites in the United States. Tours of the Myrtles have become one of its primary sources of income, with special attention given to the haunted aspects of the property. Visitors are regaled with stories of Chloe, the lady on the stairs, the ghost children, and the mysterious mirror. The plantation offers both daytime tours, focused more on its historical significance, and nighttime ghost tours, which attract those with a keen interest in the paranormal. The latter is often described as a spine-chilling experience, as guests are guided through dimly lit halls, encouraged to stay alert for signs of the supernatural. For many who visit, the allure of the Myrtles lies in the possibility of experiencing something unexplainable. Even for those who leave without seeing a ghost, the ambience of the old plantation, with its creaking floors, aged walls, and dark history, creates a sense of mystery that lingers long after they've left. It's this atmosphere that keeps people coming back, hoping for a fleeting encounter with the unknown. The Myrtles plantation's haunted reputation has seeped into popular culture. Over the years, it has been featured in countless books, television shows, documentaries, and films, each contributing to the plantation's growing mystique. It's a frequent stop on lists of America's most haunted places, and its stories are retold in ghost books, podcasts, and documentaries about haunted locations. Shows like Unsolved Mysteries, Ghost Adventures, and Ghost Hunters have explored the Myrtles, bringing its haunted history into millions of living rooms across the world. These programs typically focus on the plantation's most famous spirits, like Chloe and the ghostly children, and attempt to capture evidence of the supernatural. While skeptics question the authenticity of such shows, their influence on the Myrtles' legacy cannot be denied. Each investigation, each retelling of the plantation's haunted tales, has added another layer to the mythology of the Myrtles. Beyond paranormal TV shows, the Myrtles has also inspired works of fiction. Authors have drawn upon the plantation's haunting legacy, weaving its ghost stories into novels and short stories. The Myrtles has come to symbolize not just a haunted house, but a quintessential Southern ghost story, where history and folklore mix with the eerie atmosphere of a grand old estate. The influence of the Myrtles plantation has also permeated local culture. The surrounding community, though aware of the supernatural stories, views the plantation with a mixture of pride and curiosity. For many locals, the Myrtles is both a link to the area's history and a constant reminder of the South's complex and painful past. While some embrace the haunted reputation as a point of local intrigue, others prefer to focus on the plantation's role in history, emphasizing its architectural and cultural significance. With the increasing interest in the paranormal, the owners and caretakers of the Myrtles plantation have worked to preserve not only its historical significance, but also its ghostly legacy. The current owners are keenly aware that the plantation's haunted reputation is a major draw for visitors, and they've embraced it as part of the plantation's identity. In doing so, they've taken steps to ensure that the stories of the plantation's spirits continue to be told while maintaining the authenticity and historical accuracy of the estate. Preservation efforts at the Myrtles include maintaining the house in its original 18th and 19th century condition, allowing visitors to step back in time as they tour the estate. The caretakers have worked to strike a delicate balance between honoring the historical importance of the plantation and capitalizing on its haunted reputation. Historical plaques and informational guides focus on the plantation's architecture, its role in the South, and the families who live there, while tours emphasize the ghost stories that have made the Myrtles famous. As part of their preservation efforts, the owners have also been open to paranormal research teams visiting the plantation. These teams often use the latest technology in ghost hunting, from thermal cameras to audio recorders, in an attempt to document the unexplained phenomena that continue to fascinate visitors. By allowing these investigations to continue, the Myrtles Plantation remains at the forefront of paranormal research, further solidifying its status as one of the most haunted places in the United States. At its core, the Myrtles Plantation is a place where history and hauntings are intertwined. The stories of its spirits are inextricably linked to the tragedies and hardships endured by those who lived and worked there. Whether it's the ghost of Chloe, said to be trapped in an endless cycle of guilt, or the spirits of the Woodruff children, forever bound to the house they once called home. The hauntings of the Myrtles are a reflection of the darker aspects of its history. The plantation's connection to the institution of slavery adds another layer of complexity to its haunted legacy. The presence of enslaved people on the plantation, including the figure of Chloe, serves as a reminder of the pain and suffering that occurred on the land. The hauntings at the Myrtles are not just about eerie occurrences and ghostly figures. They are about reckoning with the difficult truths of the past. Many believe that the spirits who remain at the Myrtles are not simply trapped between worlds. They're symbolic of the unresolved trauma and loss that the plantation witnessed over the centuries. For visitors, this connection between history and the paranormal makes the Myrtles Plantation an especially compelling and thought-provoking place. It's not just about seeing a ghost. It's about experiencing a space where the past feels alive and where history is not easily forgotten. The spirits that reportedly haunt the plantation serve as reminders of the lives once lived there, lives filled with both beauty and tragedy, hope and despair. As the years go by, the Myrtles Plantation's haunted reputation only seems to grow. Each new generation brings with it more visitors, more ghost hunters, and more believers eager to experience the supernatural for themselves. The plantation's enduring mystery, its ability to capture the imagination of those who visit, ensures that its ghost stories will continue to be told for years to come. Whether the hauntings at the Myrtles are the result of restless spirits, the lingering energy of the past, or simply the power of suggestion, one thing is clear. The Myrtles Plantation has carved out a unique place in both history and folklore. It remains a place where the line between the real and the unreal, the past and the present, is blurred. A place where the living and the dead seem to coexist, if only for a fleeting moment. To those who believe, the Myrtles offers a rare glimpse into the world beyond, a chance to walk among ghosts and confront the unknown. And for those who leave unconvinced, it remains a beautiful, if eerie, reminder of the South's rich and complicated history. In either case, the Myrtles Plantation continues to cast its spell on all who enter, ensuring that its haunted legacy will live on. The airfield was alive with a constant hum. Engines roared, tools clattered, and the wind carried the sharp, acrid scent of oil and metal. It was 1920, and the airmen at RAF Scampton, a remote airbase in the English countryside, were used to the chaotic rhythm of their days. Planes would land and take off at all hours, and between the mechanical whine of engines, the men worked tirelessly to keep them in the air. It was a place that thrived on precision, but beneath that facade of order, there was chaos within the machines and the men who kept them running. Freddie Jackson was a part of this world. He was one of the many mechanics who worked long hours ensuring the safety of the aircraft. Unlike some of his colleagues, who found solace in the repetitive grind of fixing engines, Freddie was restless. His hands were steady, but his mind rarely was. He had a quick smile and a laugh that could brighten the darkest mood, but there were days when the shadows crept into his eyes, as if a storm was brewing just beneath the surface. Freddie had always been a bit of a daredevil. Even before he joined the Air Force, he had a reputation for taking risks, sometimes unnecessary ones. He would drink more than he should, stay up long past the point of exhaustion, and push himself beyond his limits. His friends saw it as part of his charm, a kind of reckless bravery that suited a man working in such a dangerous environment. But there was more to it than that. Freddy was running from something, though no one quite knew what. Maybe he didn't know either. In the mess hall, Freddy was a popular figure. He could tell a joke that would have the entire room in stitches, and his easygoing nature meant he had friends in every corner of the base. But when the laughter died down and the long night settled over the airfield, Freddy would find himself alone, staring at the bottom of a bottle or out into the dark sky, searching for something he couldn't quite name. His comrades never thought much of it. They were all a little rough around the edges, after all. The war had taken its toll on each of them, and everyone had their own way of coping. For some, it was gambling. For others, it was the numbing comfort of drink or the reckless thrill of dangerous stunts. Freddy's self-destructive streak was no secret, but he was good at what he did. No one doubted his skill as a mechanic. He could coax life back into engines that seemed beyond repair, and he had an uncanny knack for knowing when something was wrong just by the sound of a plane's hum. But there were days when Freddy's eyes were red-rimmed, and his hands shook ever so slightly, and his friends would look the other way, pretending not to notice. It was easier that way. "Hey, Freddy, you think you can fix this mess before we have to put it back up there?" called out James, a fellow mechanic, slapping the wing of a biplane that had seen better days. Freddy glanced up from his work, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Course I can," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Just keep your hands off it, and we'll be fine." There was laughter, but it was forced, like they were trying to chase away the tension that hung over the airfield like a storm cloud. The airmen lived for these moments of camaraderie. They were a tight-knit group, bound by the shared knowledge that any day could be their last. The aircraft they serviced weren't just machines. They were lifelines, the difference between making it home and not. But the constant pressure wore on them. There were days when Freddy could see it in their eyes, the way they all carried themselves a little more heavily, like they were trudging through an invisible fog. Freddy knew that feeling well. It was there every morning, in the split second after he woke up, but before he remembered where he was. It was a hollow ache that gnawed at him, a feeling that no amount of liquor or laughter could quite chase away. Sometimes he would climb up onto the wing of a plane and just sit there, watching the horizon as the sun dipped below the clouds, the sky painted in shades of gold and crimson. It was beautiful, but it also felt like an end, a reminder that everything, even the brightest day, would fade into darkness. One evening, after a long shift, Freddy sat with a few of the guys in the mess hall, nursing a drink. It had been a rough day, with more than one near miss and a lot of frayed nerves. Freddy's laugh was a little louder than usual, his jokes a little sharper, like he was trying to drown out something that only he could hear. "You're gonna drink yourself into an early grave, mate," said Tom, one of the pilots, with a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Freddy just shrugged, tipping his glass back and letting the warmth slide down his throat. "Better than going slow," he said, and there was a moment of silence, heavy and uncomfortable, before someone changed the subject. They all knew what he meant. No one wanted to talk about it, but it was there, unspoken. The understanding that they were all just trying to keep themselves together until the next day. As the night wore on, Freddy slipped out, leaving the noise behind. He wandered the airfield, hands shoved into his pockets, the cold air biting at his skin. He paused by one of the planes, running his fingers along the smooth metal, his breath misting in the dark. He felt a strange kinship with the aircraft, both of them patched up and pushed to their limits, holding together by sheer force of will. Freddy didn't know why he did half the things he did. Maybe it was because he felt like he was always on borrowed time, like there was something chasing him, and if he stopped moving, it would catch up. He wanted to be brave, but there were nights when he was just tired, and all he could do was stand there, staring out at the empty airstrip, feeling like he was standing on the edge of something he couldn't see. And so, The days passed. The engines roared. The planes flew. And Freddie kept going, one foot in front of the other, holding on to the things that made sense to him. But even then, he could feel it, the cracks starting to show. The way his hands would tremble when he thought no one was looking. The way he would flinch at the sound of a distant explosion, as if the war was still there, lurking in the shadows. In the end, they were all just trying to survive in their own ways. And maybe that was why no one said anything when Freddie took one more drink or stayed out on the airfield a little too long, staring into the dark. They all understood, even if they didn't have the words to say it. The morning of the accident started like any other at the airfield. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon, and the ground was still wet with dew as the airmen went about their routines. Engines revved. Pilots prepared their flight plans, and the mechanics, including Freddie Jackson, worked to ensure every aircraft was ready to take to the skies. It was a regular day, one that would end up far from ordinary. Freddie hadn't slept much the night before. He had stayed up, drinking and joking with a few friends, trying to shake off the restlessness that had been clinging to him for weeks. When he finally stumbled into bed, he could barely close his eyes without the room spinning around him. He was groggy and irritable, his hands shaky, but he still showed up to work. He always did. The airfield was bustling by the time Freddie arrived. He dragged a hand through his hair, trying to clear his head, and headed to his station. There were planes lined up for routine checks, and he was assigned to inspect one of the newer biplanes. It was a task he could do in his sleep, and most days, it felt like he did. "Morning, Freddie. You look like hell," James greeted, giving him a pat on the back. James's tone was light, but there was concern in his eyes. It wasn't the first time he'd seen Freddie looking worn out. Lately, it seemed like there were more bad days than good ones. Freddie grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, well, it's my natural state," he joked, picking up his tools and getting to work. "Just keep your eyes on those gauges, and we'll be fine." The morning passed in a blur of noise and motion. Freddie moved from plane to plane, tightening bolts, checking fuel lines, and making small adjustments. His hands worked on autopilot, but his mind felt like it was floating somewhere just out of reach. He knew the routine so well that he could almost do it without thinking, but today, there was a creeping sense of unease he couldn't shake. It was around midday when things took a turn. One of the pilots, a young man named Arthur, was preparing for a test flight. The plane had just been serviced, and it was supposed to be a quick routine check. Freddie had been one of the last to work on it, and he had given it the all clear. As Arthur climbed into the cockpit, Freddie caught sight of him and gave a thumbs up, a casual sign of reassurance. But his smile faded as soon as the plane began to taxi down the runway. The engine stuttered, coughed, and then roared to life. For a moment, everything seemed fine. But then, without warning, the plane veered to one side, the nose dipping dangerously. Freddie's heart skipped a beat, and he felt a cold, creeping dread wash over him as he watched. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't understand what. Arthur tried to correct the plane, but it was too late. The biplane jerked and twisted, the wings catching the ground as it skidded, flipping over in a sickening slow-motion roll. The sound of metal crunching and the deafening roar of the crash echoed across the airfield. Freddie felt frozen, his feet rooted to the spot as he watched the disaster unfold in front of him. Shouts filled the air, and people started running toward the wreckage. Freddie was one of the first to move, sprinting across the field, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He could smell the smoke, sharp and acrid, burning the back of his throat. He didn't care. He just had to get there, had to do something. When he reached the plane, it was already clear that it was bad. The cockpit was a mangled mess of metal and shattered glass, and Arthur was slumped over, unmoving. Freddie's hands shook as he tried to pull the twisted frame apart, desperate to reach him. "Come on, Arthur, stay with me," he muttered under his breath, his voice choked with panic. But there was nothing he could do. The medics arrived within minutes, pulling Freddie away as they worked to free Arthur. Freddie stood there, helpless, his clothes smeared with oil and dirt, his hands trembling. He watched as they lifted Arthur's limp body out of the wreckage, his face pale, his uniform stained with blood. There was no need to say it out loud. The silence that followed spoke volumes. The rest of the day passed in a haze. The airfield, normally so full of life, felt hollow, as if the crash had sucked all the air out of it. The men gathered in small, quiet groups, whispering and glancing over at the twisted wreckage, still lying on the runway like a dark stain. Freddie stayed close to the hangar, away from the others. He didn't want to hear the whispers or see the pity in their eyes. He kept replaying the morning over and over in his head, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Had he missed something? Was there a mistake he didn't catch? The questions gnawed at him, relentless and cruel. He was a good mechanic. He prided himself on that. But now, all he could think about was the look on Arthur's face, the way he had smiled just before he climbed into the cockpit. "Freddie, it's not your fault," James said quietly, coming up beside him. "These things happen. Sometimes it's just bad luck." Freddie clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. "No," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I should have known. I should have seen it." He didn't know what he was supposed to have seen, but it didn't matter. The guilt was like a weight, crushing his chest, making it hard to breathe. That night, Freddie found himself alone again, but this time, the silence felt unbearable. He didn't go to the mess hall. He couldn't face the others, couldn't bear to see their faces, knowing they were thinking about the same thing he was. Instead, he wandered out to the edge of the airfield, a bottle in hand, the cold night air biting at his skin. He drank and drank, but the numbness he was searching for never quite came. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see the crash, hear the screech of metal, and the shouts echoing in his ears. The bottle slipped from his grasp, shattering on the ground, and he sank to his knees, his hands shaking so badly he could barely keep them still. There was no way to escape it. The guilt, the fear, the sickening feeling that he had let everyone down, it all swirled around him, closing in like a vice. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out, just a strangled gasp that got lost in the wind. He didn't know how long he stayed there, crumpled on the ground, but when he finally looked up, the sky was dark, the stars glinting coldly above him. For the first time, Freddie realized he was afraid, not just of what had happened, but of what might happen next. He had always prided himself on being able to handle anything, but now he felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into a void that he couldn't pull himself back from. The next morning, Freddie showed up to work, but it was like he was moving through a fog. The airfield seemed quieter than usual, the men subdued, their faces drawn and tired. There was no laughter, no easy banter, just the grim, heavy silence that followed in the wake of tragedy. And for Freddie, that silence was worse than anything else. Because in that silence, there was nowhere to hide from the truth. Something had broken, and he didn't know how to fix it. The weeks after the crash were a blur. The airfield, usually bustling with noise and life, had settled into a somber rhythm. The men went about their duties with a sense of quiet determination, avoiding eye contact and speaking in hushed tones. The wreckage had long been cleared, but the memory of what happened still lingered like a dark cloud over the base. Freddie Jackson was still there, but he wasn't really there. He moved through his days mechanically, his mind somewhere else, his eyes haunted. Everyone at the airfield knew that Freddie had taken Arthur's death hard. Most of them had lost friends before. It was part of the job, but this was different. Freddie hadn't just lost a friend. He felt like he had failed one. And no matter how many times people tried to tell him it wasn't his fault, He couldn't shake the feeling that he should have done something, seen something, that would have changed everything. Freddy's nights became a series of long, solitary walks around the airfield, usually with a bottle hidden in his jacket. He would sit on the wing of an old plane, staring out into the darkness, letting the cold seep into his skin until he felt numb. The alcohol helped dull the edges of his thoughts, but it never silenced them completely. He was spiraling, and he knew it, but he couldn't figure out how to stop. The emptiness was always there, gnawing at him, no matter how hard he tried to fill it. It was on one of those nights that James approached him. Freddy hadn't seen him coming, and when James sat down beside him on the wing, Freddy nearly dropped his bottle. "You're gonna catch your death out here," James said, his voice gentle but firm. He didn't look at Freddy, just stared out into the dark, his hands shoved into his pockets. "You don't have to do this alone, you know." Freddy laughed, but it was a hollow, brittle sound. "What am I supposed to do then? Pretend everything's fine?" "Because it's not." James didn't respond right away. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the distant hum of a generator and the occasional rustle of wind. Finally, James spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We're taking a group photo tomorrow. For the squadron. Thought you might want to be there." Freddy hesitated. It felt wrong. The idea of standing in front of a camera, smiling, as if everything was back to normal. But there was something in James's tone, a quiet insistence, that made it hard to saying no. "I'll think about it," he said, which was the closest he could come to agreeing. The next day dawned gray and overcast, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. The mood around the airfield was subdued, as if the weather had seeped into everyone's bones. When Freddy showed up at the hangar, he was surprised to see how many of the men were already there, dressed in their uniforms, trying to smooth out their jackets and straighten their caps. For a moment, it felt like things were almost normal again, like they were just a group of friends getting ready to have their picture taken, rather than a team struggling to hold themselves together. The photographer, an older man with a thick mustache and a gruff manner, barked orders at the men, directing them into place. "Stand straight, look sharp. We're not here to waste time," he said, snapping his fingers at anyone who moved too slowly. Freddy found himself near the back, squeezed between James and another mechanic named Tom. He felt out of place, like he was watching the whole thing from a distance. "Smile, Freddy," James said, nudging him with his elbow. "It won't kill you." Freddy forced a grin, though it felt more like a grimace. The photographer raised his camera, and for a moment, everything seemed to stand still. Then there was a flash, a click, and it was over. The men broke apart, talking and laughing as they headed back to their duties, the moment already fading from memory. Freddy lingered, watching them go, feeling an odd sense of disconnection. He hadn't realized how much he missed that sound, the easy banter, the jokes. It made him ache, because it reminded him of how things used to be before everything went wrong. A few days later, the photograph arrived. The photographer had developed it quickly, and a small group gathered around to take a look. It was a decent shot, considering the conditions. The men were standing in neat rows, their uniforms crisp, their faces solemn but not without a hint of a smile. James spotted Freddy and waved him over. "Here it is," James said, holding up the photograph. "We don't look half bad, do we?" Freddy took the picture, glancing over it without much interest. But as his eyes scanned the rows of faces, he felt his heart stop. There, standing at the edge of the group, almost hidden in the shadow of the hangar, was a face he recognized all too well. It was Arthur. Freddy blinked, convinced he was imagining things. He looked again, harder this time, but the face didn't disappear. It was Arthur, staring straight at the camera, his expression calm and steady, as if he had never been gone at all. The room was suddenly too bright, the air too thin. Freddy stumbled back, nearly dropping the photograph. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. That's impossible. What's impossible? James asked, frowning. Freddie, what's wrong? Freddie shoved the photograph into James's hands, his fingers shaking. Look, he said, his voice barely more than a rasp. Tell me you see it too. James studied the picture, his brow furrowing. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Freddie thought he was going to dismiss it, tell him he was imagining things. But then James's eyes widened, and he looked up, his face pale. How? He started, but he didn't finish the question. He didn't have to. They both knew what he was seeing. Word spread quickly across the airfield. Men who hadn't been interested in the photograph before were suddenly clamoring to see it, passing it around with a mix of awe and unease. Some tried to laugh it off, calling it a trick of the light, a flaw in the film. But others weren't so sure. They had known Arthur, had seen him smiling and joking just like everyone else. They had mourned him. And now, there he was, staring back at them from a photograph that shouldn't have been able to capture him. Freddie felt like he was losing his grip on reality. He had been struggling to hold himself together ever since the crash, but this was too much. He wanted to believe it was just a mistake, that there was some logical explanation. But every time he looked at the photograph, he felt a chill run down his spine, as if someone was walking over his grave. It doesn't make sense, he muttered, mostly to himself. He's gone. I saw it. We all did. James placed a hand on his shoulder, his expression grim. Maybe he's trying to tell us something. The words sent a shiver through Freddie. Tell us what? He asked, but James just shook his head. He didn't have an answer, and neither did anyone else. The photograph was a mystery, one that none of them could explain. It felt like a message, but no one knew what it was supposed to mean. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at the airfield grew tense. The photograph was pinned up in the mess hall, where anyone could see it, and every time Freddie walked past, he felt a knot tighten in his chest. The men started to whisper, not just about the photograph, but about the strange things that had been happening since the crash, the tools that went missing, only to turn up in odd places, the flicker of shadows where there shouldn't have been any, the feeling that they were being watched. Freddie didn't want to believe in ghosts. But late at night, when he was alone and the air was still, he could feel something pressing in around him, heavy and suffocating. He thought about Arthur, about the way he had looked in the photograph, and he wondered if maybe James was right. Maybe Arthur was trying to tell them something. Or maybe, Freddie thought, his mind darkening, it was something worse. Maybe it was a warning. The airfield was no longer the familiar, bustling place it had once been. Since the photograph appeared, a suffocating tension seemed to hang in the air, thick and heavy, making it hard for the men to go about their routines. Conversations that used to be filled with laughter had turned quiet, filled with nervous glances and uneasy murmurs. No one spoke about the photograph outright, but it was on everyone's mind. Freddie could see it in their faces, in the way they moved, cautious and alert, as if expecting something to happen at any moment. Freddie himself was barely holding it together. He had stopped trying to convince himself that everything was fine, because it clearly wasn't. Every day felt like he was walking through a nightmare, one he couldn't wake up from. And every time he saw Arthur's face in that photograph, he felt a chill seep into his bones. It wasn't just the image of his dead friend that haunted him. It was the feeling that Arthur was still there, somewhere, watching. The strange occurrences that had begun after the crash were becoming harder to ignore. At first, it had been small things. The misplaced tools, the flickering lights, the occasional murmur of voices when no one else was around. But as the days passed, the incidents grew more unsettling. One evening, Freddie was working late in the hangar, trying to lose himself in the monotony of fixing an engine. The hangar was quiet, the only sounds the soft clink of metal and the hum of machinery. But then he heard a faint whisper, just behind his ear. He spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was no one. Just the empty, dimly lit hangar, shadows stretching across the floor. He told himself he was imagining things, that he was just tired. But then it happened again, a low, indistinct murmur, like someone speaking just out of earshot. This time, he didn't turn around. He just closed his eyes and tried to focus on his breathing, willing the whisper to stop. But it didn't. Instead, it grew louder, more insistent, until he could almost make out words. His hands began to shake, and he dropped his wrench, the clatter echoing through the empty space. He wanted to run, but his feet felt glued to the spot. It wasn't until he heard a loud bang, like something falling, that he finally snapped out of it and bolted for the door, his heart pounding. Outside, the cool night air hit his face, sharp and biting, and he took a deep, shaky breath. He stood there for a moment, trying to steady himself before looking back at the hangar. Nothing seemed out of place, but he could still feel the whispering, like it was lingering just out of reach. He didn't go back inside. Instead, he headed straight for his bunk, where he lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. The next morning, Freddy didn't mention what had happened. He didn't want to talk about it. Didn't want to admit that he was starting to crack. But when he showed up for roll call, he could see that he wasn't the only one on edge. James, who was usually so upbeat, looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. Tom, another mechanic, was fidgeting with his hands, his gaze darting around nervously. It was as if the whole squadron was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That day, they had a maintenance check on one of the old biplanes. It was a simple task, one they had done hundreds of times before. But as Freddy climbed into the cockpit to check the controls, he felt a jolt of unease. The seat was cold, colder than it should have been, and for a moment, he felt like he was sitting in someone else's place. He brushed it off, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But when he reached for the throttle, his hand froze. There, etched faintly into the metal, were the initials, a J. Freddy's breath caught in his throat. Arthur Jameson. Arthur's initials. He stared at them, unblinking, his mind struggling to make sense of it. The letters were faint, almost worn away, like they had been there for years. But he knew they hadn't been. He would have seen them before. Freddy jumped out of the cockpit, his hands clammy, and rushed to find James. When he found him, he didn't even bother with a greeting. "You need to see this," he said, his voice tight with urgency. James followed him back to the plane, his expression puzzled. But when he saw the initials, his confusion turned to alarm. "Do you think?" James began, but he didn't finish the question. He didn't have to. They both knew what he was asking. Freddy didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. All he could think about was the photograph, the whispering, and now this. It felt like the air around them was closing in, suffocating. He wanted to believe there was a rational explanation, that someone was playing a cruel joke. But deep down, he was beginning to suspect the truth was far more terrifying. The rumors spread fast. By the end of the day, everyone on the base had heard about the initials. Some of the men tried to laugh it off, saying it was just a coincidence, but their laughter sounded forced, hollow. Others started avoiding the hangar altogether, as if they could feel the same creeping unease that Freddy did. And then there were those who began to whisper, not just about Arthur, but about ghosts. Freddy hated that word. It made everything feel more real, more impossible to ignore. But the signs were everywhere, and they were getting harder to dismiss. One night, he was lying in his bunk, staring at the photograph that someone had left on his bedside table. He didn't know who had put it there, and he didn't want to know. He was about to turn off the light when he heard a sound, soft and rhythmic like footsteps. He sat up, his heart thudding in his chest, and listened. The footsteps were faint, almost like someone walking on tiptoe. They moved down the hallway, slow and deliberate, stopping right outside his door. Freddy held his breath, waiting for them to move on, but they didn't. They just stood there, silent, like they were waiting for him to do something. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. There was no answer, but he could feel a presence, heavy and cold, pressing against the door. He stayed like that for what felt like hours, his eyes fixed on the handle, half expecting it to turn. But it never did. Eventually, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance, leaving him alone in the dark. Freddy didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he found James and told him everything: the whispers, the initials, the footsteps. He expected James to tell him he was overreacting, that he needed to get some rest. But instead, James just nodded, his expression grim. "You're not the only one, Freddy," he said quietly. "Others have been hearing things too. Seeing things." It was the confirmation Freddy had been dreading. He had been hoping, even praying, that it was all in his head, that he was just losing it. But if other people were experiencing the same thing, then it was real. And if it was real, then there was no escaping it. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker. More men began reporting strange occurrences, doors that creaked open on their own, tools that vanished without a trace, voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Some of them even claimed to have seen Arthur, standing at the edge of the airfield, watching them. Freddy wanted to tell them they were imagining things, but he couldn't bring himself to say it, because he had seen it too. One night, after another restless, sleepless evening, Freddy found himself back in the hangar, staring at the photograph pinned to the wall. He didn't know why he kept coming back to it, why he couldn't just let it go. Maybe he was looking for answers, or maybe he was just waiting for something to change. But as he stood there, staring at Arthur's face, he felt a strange sense of calm, as if everything was finally starting to make sense. Maybe Arthur was trying to reach out, to say something that he hadn't been able to say before. Or maybe he was stuck, trapped between this world and the next, unable to move on. Freddy didn't know, but he could feel the pull, the invisible thread that connected them, and he knew it was only a matter of time before something gave. As he turned to leave, he heard a whisper, soft and clear, cutting through the stillness of the hangar. "Freddy." It was Arthur's voice, unmistakable, and it sent a shiver down his spine. He didn't turn around. He just stood there, frozen, as the voice whispered again, more insistent this time. "Freddy, help me." For the first time in weeks, Freddy felt a glimmer of hope. If Arthur was trying to communicate, then maybe he could figure out what he wanted. Maybe he could help him find peace. But even as he clung to that hope, a part of him knew that whatever was happening was far from over. It was just beginning, and he was standing right at the center of it. The airfield had become a place of restless, unspoken fears. The men moved like ghosts themselves, avoiding the hangar, the photograph, and, most of all, Freddy. They could sense something different about him, something heavy and unsettling, like he was carrying a burden they couldn't see. He was still showing up for work, still going through the motions, but there was a hollowness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a kind of quiet desperation that set him apart from the others. Freddy had spent sleepless nights trying to piece together what was happening. The whispers, the initials on the plane, the footsteps, each event felt like part of a larger puzzle, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't see the full picture. He knew Arthur was trying to communicate with him. He could feel it, a presence that lingered just at the edge of his consciousness, pulling him closer, urging him to listen. But the more he tried to understand, the more confused he became. The base was no longer just a workplace. It was a labyrinth of shadows and echoes, and Freddy felt like he was lost somewhere in the middle, unable to find his way out. Every night, he would return to the hangar, staring at the photograph, waiting for the whispers to come. He didn't know what he was expecting, maybe another message, maybe a sign. But each time he heard Arthur's voice, it was the same, repeating that same plea. Help me. As the days went on, the strange occurrences only escalated. The whispers became more frequent, no longer confined to the quiet of the night. Men began reporting cold spots, sudden drafts of icy air that seemed to come out of nowhere, sending shivers down their spines even in the middle of summer. Tools would disappear, only to reappear in places they had no reason to be, like the mess hall or the barracks. And then there were the sightings' fleeting glimpses of a figure, standing just at the edge of the runway, barely visible in the fading light. Freddy wasn't the only one who saw him. Others had started to see Arthur, too, and the stories spread quickly, each one more unnerving than the last. Some said they had seen him standing by the hangar, his uniform neat, his face calm, like he was waiting for something. Others claimed to have seen him in the barracks, sitting on an empty bunk, staring at the wall. But every account had one thing in common: the look in Arthur's eyes. A look of sadness, of longing, as if he was searching for something he couldn't find. James was the first to confront Freddy about it. One evening, after another long, grueling day, he found Freddy in the hangar, staring at the photograph, the same way he had been every night for weeks. James approached him cautiously, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile hold Freddy had on reality. "Freddy," James said, his voice soft but firm, "you need to stop this. Whatever's happening, it's not your fault. You can't keep torturing yourself like this." Freddy didn't look at him. "You don't understand," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Arthur is trying to tell me something. He needs my help." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're not making sense. Arthur's gone, Freddy. Whatever you think you're hearing, it's not real. You need to let it go." Freddy turned to face him, and for a moment, James recoiled at the intensity in his eyes. "You think I want to believe this?" Freddy snapped, his voice cracking with frustration. "You think I want to spend every night listening to whispers in the dark, wondering if I'm losing my mind. But I'm telling you, it's real. I've heard him. I've seen him." James hesitated, torn between wanting to comfort his friend and the fear that there was nothing he could say to make things better. "Even if it is real, what are you going to do?" he asked quietly. "You can't bring him back." Freddy didn't answer. He just looked back at the photograph, his eyes distant, lost. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I have to try. I can't keep living like this." That night, Freddy made up his mind. He didn't know how, but he was going to find a way to reach Arthur, to figure out what he was trying to say. He couldn't keep running from it, couldn't keep pretending that everything was normal, because it wasn't, and it never would be until he found a way to understand what was happening. He waited until the base had quieted down, until most of the men had gone to bed. Then he slipped out of his bunk, making his way to the hangar with a flashlight in hand. The air was cool and the sky was clear, a sharp contrast to the darkness that seemed to have settled over the airfield. As he approached the hangar, he could feel his heart begin to race, his pulse pounding in his ears, but he didn't stop. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to turn back now. Inside, the hangar was dark and silent, the only light coming from the faint glow of his flashlight. He made his way to the old biplane, the one with Arthur's initials, and climbed into the cockpit. He didn't know what he was expecting to find, but as he sat there, surrounded by the familiar smell of oil and metal, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him, as if he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "Arthur," he whispered, his voice echoing in the stillness. "If you're here, if you can hear me, I'm listening." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, slowly, the air around him began to change. It was subtle at first, a faint chill that prickled his skin, but it grew stronger, sharper, until it felt like he was standing in the middle of a freezing wind. And then he heard it, a whisper, so soft he almost missed it, but unmistakable. Freddy. He turned, his flashlight sweeping across the hangar, but there was no one there. "I'm here, Arthur," he said, louder this time, his voice steady even though his hands were shaking. "What do you want me to do?" The whisper came again, clearer this time, and Freddy felt a shiver run down his spine. "I need you to remember." "Remember what?" Freddy asked, his voice rising with frustration. "I don't understand." "Please, just tell me." The hangar seemed to grow darker, the shadows deepening, and for a moment, Freddy thought he saw something move out of the corner of his eye, a figure, standing just at the edge of the light. He swung the flashlight around, and there, barely visible in the darkness, was Arthur. He looked exactly as he had in life, his uniform crisp, his cap tilted at a slight angle, his face calm. But there was something different about him now, something sad and distant, as if he was struggling to hold on to whatever was keeping him there. Freddy felt his throat tighten. "Arthur," he whispered. "What happened? Why are you still here?" Arthur didn't answer right away. He just looked at Freddy, his eyes filled with an emotion that was impossible to read. And then, slowly, he raised his hand, pointing to the biplane, to the initials etched into the metal. "Remember," he said, his voice barely more than a sigh, "it wasn't your fault." Freddy blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "I don't." Before he could finish, the hangar was filled with a loud, echoing bang, like the sound of an engine misfiring. Freddy flinched, his flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. When he looked up, Arthur was gone, the darkness swallowing him whole. Freddy stumbled out of the cockpit, his hands trembling, his mind reeling. It wasn't his fault. That's what Arthur had said. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Something he was missing, something Arthur was trying to show him. And as he stood there, alone in the dark, he realized he couldn't do this by himself. He needed help. The next morning, Freddy went to James. He told him everything, from the whispers to the sighting in the hangar, and for the first time, James didn't try to dismiss it. He listened, his expression serious, and when Freddy was done, he nodded. "If Arthur's trying to reach out, then maybe we need to find a way to reach back," James said. "But we're not going to do it alone. Whatever's happening, we're going to face it together." It was the first time in weeks that Freddy felt a flicker of hope. He didn't know what lay ahead, or if they would ever get the answers they were looking for. But at least now, he wasn't alone. And as they stood there, staring at the photograph pinned to the wall, he couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, they were finally getting closer to the truth. Whatever had kept Arthur tethered to this place, whatever message he was trying to deliver, Freddy was determined to uncover it. And this time, he wasn't going to run. The Bell family lived a quiet and peaceful life in the rural countryside of Adams, Tennessee, in the early 19th century. John Bell, the patriarch, was a well-respected farmer who had moved to the area with his wife, Lucy, and their children, hoping to build a prosperous and serene life. Their farmhouse, nestled among sprawling fields and towering trees, seemed like the perfect place to raise a family. Little did they know, something far darker lurked beneath the calm surface of their lives. It was in 1817 when strange things began to occur on the Bell property. At first, the signs were subtle and easy to dismiss. John would occasionally see odd animals wandering near the edges of his fields, creatures he couldn't quite identify, their forms shifting and unnatural. He spotted what looked like a large dog with a rabbit's head, and another time, a bird too large for the region perched in a tree. These sightings left him uneasy, but he chalked them up to tricks of the mind, refusing to believe anything was truly wrong. Soon, however, the strange events escalated beyond harmless wildlife. The first real sign of trouble came when John Bell began hearing odd sounds around the farmhouse. At night, the walls creaked and groaned in ways that didn't seem natural, like the wood itself was trying to speak. The noise of knocking echoed through the rooms, and sometimes it seemed like chains were being dragged across the floor, though nothing was ever found out of place. It wasn't long before the rest of the family began to notice these sounds as well. The Bell children, especially young Betsy, started waking up terrified, claiming they heard faint whispering in their ears while they slept. Lucy Bell, though skeptical at first, could no longer deny that something was very wrong when she too began hearing unexplained sounds, as though someone or something was watching them from just beyond their sight. One evening, as the family sat around their dinner table, a loud, sharp knock came from the front door. John, thinking it might be a late visitor or a neighbor in need, got up to answer it, only to find no one there. The knock came again, this time from the back door, but once again, there was no one in sight. The third knock came from inside the house itself. The family sat frozen in fear, unable to explain how this could be happening. They had begun to realize that something far more sinister than a prank was at play. Over the next few days, the haunting sounds grew louder and more frequent. It was as though the house had come alive with a presence that couldn't be seen, but was undeniably there. The walls echoed with strange voices, doors creaked open and shut on their own, and footsteps could be heard pacing through empty rooms. Yet, whenever the family tried to investigate, they found nothing. It was as though an invisible force had taken up residence in their home, and it wasn't going to leave anytime soon. John Bell, being a man of faith and reason, sought to keep his family calm, reassuring them that there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps it was the wind or some natural phenomena, but deep down, he knew better. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and no amount of reason could explain away the growing terror they felt each night. Despite his outward calm, he couldn't shake the creeping fear that this presence had come for him. Specifically, the once tranquil Bell home had become a place of dread. No longer able to ignore the strange happenings, John confided in a close neighbor, seeking advice on what to do. But the neighbor had no solutions. Word began to spread in the small community that the Bell family was experiencing something otherworldly, though few believed it at first. After all, who would believe that a house could be haunted by something invisible, something so relentless and violent? The days passed, but the entity showed no sign of leaving. The family could no longer sleep through the night, as the knocking, the scratching sounds, and the heavy footsteps never ceased. It was as if the entity wanted them to know it was always there, lurking just beyond the edge of their understanding, waiting for something darker yet to come. As the weeks wore on, the Bell family found themselves slipping into a state of constant fear and exhaustion. They had no idea what the entity wanted, but they knew it wasn't going to leave on its own. Whatever this presence was, it had taken root in their home, and they were helpless to stop it. The Bell Witch had arrived, and the nightmare was only beginning. As the days turned into weeks, the Bell family's quiet farmhouse became a place of escalating fear and confusion. What had begun as strange noises and eerie disturbances quickly transformed into something far more aggressive. It seemed the entity, whatever it was growing stronger. No longer content with simply haunting the house, it began to physically target the family, with a particular focus on John Bell and his young daughter, Betsy. The first signs of the entity's more dangerous nature emerged when Betsy started to experience strange sensations at night. At first, it felt like gentle taps on her skin, like someone lightly flicking her arm. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was nothing more than her imagination. But soon, these sensations grew into something much more alarming. She would wake up in the middle of the night to the feeling of her hair being yanked, her bed covers ripped off, or an invisible hand slapping her face. These attacks left her terrified and helpless, but they were just the beginning. As Betsy's torment grew, so did the malevolent presence in the house. Objects that once sat quietly on shelves would now fly across the room without warning, smashing into walls or crashing to the floor. Chairs would tip over by themselves, and dishes would shatter for no apparent reason. The invisible force seemed to revel in causing chaos, as if it found joy in making the Bell family live in constant fear. John Bell, too, was not spared from the entity's wrath. One morning, as he was working in the fields, he felt a sudden sharp pain in his face, as though he had been struck by an unseen hand. He stumbled, clutching his cheek, but when he looked around, there was no one there. This mysterious attack repeated itself several times over the coming weeks. John would be walking through his home or tending to his land when, without warning, he would feel the sting of an invisible force hitting him. Sometimes it was a slap, other times a violent push that nearly knocked him off his feet. The relentless torment began to take its toll on the entire family. Betsy, once a bright and lively girl, became withdrawn and fearful. She spent her days in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing when the next attack would come. Her schoolwork suffered, and she became too frightened to sleep alone at night, often seeking comfort in her parents' room. The stress weighed heavily on John and Lucy Bell as well, as they watched their daughter suffer and felt powerless to stop it. Despite their growing desperation, the Bell family tried to maintain some sense of normalcy. They continued their daily routines, farming, cooking, and tending to the household, hoping that by ignoring the entity, it might go away. But the more they ignored it, the more aggressive it seemed to become. The Bell children, especially Betsy, were often targeted while they slept. On one particularly terrifying night, Betsy awoke to find herself being lifted from her bed by an unseen force. She screamed in terror, and her parents rushed to her room, only to find her suspended in midair, her body thrashing as if being held by an invisible grip. As soon as John and Lucy entered the room, Betsy was dropped back onto her bed, gasping for breath and trembling with fear. There was no explanation for what had just happened, no way to rationalize the nightmare their daughter was living through. The attacks didn't stop with Betsy. Other members of the household also began experiencing physical assaults. Knocks and slaps came out of nowhere, leaving bruises and welts on their skin. The Bell family soon realized that they were dealing with a force beyond there, understanding one that was not only malicious, but intelligent. It seemed to know exactly when and how to strike, always leaving them on edge, waiting for the next act of violence. Word of the Bell family's plight began to spread throughout the community. Neighbors who visited the house witnessed the strange occurrences for themselves, objects moving on their own, doors slamming shut, and the eerie sounds of whispering voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Some locals believed the family had fallen victim to a powerful curse, while others thought they were dealing with an angry spirit seeking revenge for some past wrong. As the entity's attacks grew more frequent and more violent, the family became desperate for answers. John Bell turned to friends and neighbors for help, hoping that someone might know how to rid their home of the invisible force. But no one had any solutions. Ministers and pastors were called in to pray over the house, but even their spiritual guidance couldn't stop the torment. The Bell family began to lose hope, feeling as though they were trapped in a nightmare with no way out. The Bell Witch, as the entity had now come to be called, was relentless. It seemed to feed off the family's fear and suffering, growing more powerful with each passing day. John Bell, in particular, seemed to be the primary target. His health began to deteriorate as the constant stress and fear took a toll on his body. His once strong frame became frail, and his hands shook with anxiety. It was clear that the entity wanted something, but what it wanted remained a mystery. Despite the family's efforts to resist, they were losing their battle against the unseen force. The Bell Witch had made its intentions clear. It wasn't going to leave until it had finished whatever dark mission it had come to carry out. And as the attacks on Betsy and John grew more intense, the family couldn't help but wonder if they would survive the ordeal. The torment had already reached unbearable heights for the Bell family, but they were about to discover that the entity haunting their home was far more terrifying than they ever imagined. What had begun as an invisible, violent presence soon revealed itself to be something that could speak, something that could communicate with chilling clarity. It wasn't just a ghost or some mindless force. It was intelligent, cunning, and it had a voice. The first time the entity spoke, it caught the family completely off guard. They had grown used to the eerie knocks, disembodied footsteps, and the unsettling physical attacks. But when the family was sitting quietly one evening, bracing themselves for whatever might come next, a voice filled the room cold, clear, and unmistakably human. It came from nowhere and everywhere all at once, as if the very walls of the house were speaking. "I am here for John Bell," the voice said plainly. The family froze, staring at one another in disbelief. Was this some kind of cruel trick? But no, they all heard it. John Bell's face drained of color. Whatever this thing was, it had just declared that it was targeting him specifically. The air in the room seemed to thicken with dread as the voice continued, sometimes mocking, sometimes angry, but always clear in its hatred for John. The entity called itself Kate, though it later became widely known as the Bell Witch, and it made no secret of its intentions. The voice was unlike anything they had ever experienced before. It wasn't just random murmurs or whispers. It spoke in full sentences, as if it were a living person. It would ask questions, make demands, and even hold conversations with the family and their visitors. What made it even more terrifying was its depth of knowledge. Kate seemed to know things about the Bell family and their neighbors, secrets, events, and details that no one outside the family could have known. It could describe what was happening in other parts of town as if it had been there itself, watching and listening. The voice also seemed to enjoy tormenting Betsy. It would call her name in the dead of night, whisper cruel things in her ear, and laugh whenever she cried out in fear. It wasn't just content with physical attacks anymore. It wanted to break her spirit, to make her feel hopeless and afraid. The once bright and happy child was now a shadow of herself, living in constant fear of when the voice would speak again, what it would say, and what it would do. John Bell was another favorite target of the witch. Kate often berated him, insulting him, and claiming that it had come to end his life. It was as though the entity had a personal vendetta against him. The reasons were never entirely clear, though rumors swirled that Kate Batts, a neighbor with whom John had a falling out over a land deal, had cursed the Bell family out of spite. Whether or not this was true didn't seem to matter. The entity that called itself Kate seemed determined to fulfill its promise. The Bell family's friends and neighbors were initially skeptical of their claims about a talking spirit. But that changed quickly when word spread of the strange occurrences, and people began visiting the Bell household themselves to hear the voice. Ministers, curious locals, and even travelers from neighboring counties came to witness the phenomenon, and none left without being thoroughly shaken by what they experienced. The witch, it seemed, enjoyed the attention, often showing off its knowledge of distant events or entertaining visitors by speaking in different voices and tones. It could imitate the voice of anyone it chose. Sometimes it would even mimic the voices of the family themselves, causing confusion and fear. As the entity continued to speak, it became clear that this was more than just a haunting. It was something far more dangerous. The witch took pleasure in manipulating those around it, bending their will through fear, and taunting them with its knowledge and power. The Bell family tried to get help from local ministers, hoping that religious intervention might drive the entity away, but nothing worked. The prayers, the exorcisms, the blessings on the house, none of it made any difference. The voice persisted, as powerful and menacing as ever. And with each passing day, the witch's focus on John Bell grew more intense. It would mock him relentlessly, whispering threats and insults while he went about his daily life. His health, already fragile from the stress of living under such torment, began to deteriorate further. He would wake up in the middle of the night to find himself unable to move, his limbs heavy as though held down by an invisible force. He started suffering from unexplained seizures, his once strong and commanding presence reduced to that of a sickly and terrified man. Despite the terror it inflicted, the Bell Witch's voice wasn't always violent. It had moments of disturbing calm where it would engage in conversations, sometimes even laughing and joking with visitors. It seemed to enjoy playing with people's emotions, luring them into a false sense of security before turning on them with renewed ferocity. The voice was always unpredictable. One moment, it would be soft and friendly, and the next it would erupt in anger, hurling insults or making sinister threats. The most chilling aspect of the witch's communication was its promise. It had come to take John Bell's life, and it wouldn't stop until it had succeeded. The family was trapped in their own home, with no means of escape from the torment that had invaded every corner of their lives. Each day brought them closer to the grim reality that the witch might indeed be able to carry out its threat. By now, the Bell Witch was not just a local legend, but a phenomenon that had captured the attention of people far and wide. Visitors continued to flock to the Bell Farm, seeking answers or hoping to experience the haunting for themselves. But for John Bell and his family, this was no spectacle. It was a living nightmare, and they were all too aware that the witch's promises were not idle threats. The Bell family had now come to understand the true nature of the entity they were dealing with. It wasn't just haunting them, it was targeting them, manipulating them, and working toward a single, terrifying goal. And as John Bell's health worsened, the family could only wait in dread, knowing that the worst was yet to come. As the witch's torment grew more relentless, it became clear that John Bell's days were numbered. The entity that had come to be known as the Bell Witch had made its intentions known from the start. It was determined to take John Bell's life, and now it seemed ready to fulfill that dark promise. Despite the Bell family's efforts to protect him, John's health was rapidly deteriorating, and there was little they could do to stop it. By late 1820, John had become a shadow of his former self. Once a strong and respected farmer, he was now a frail, weak man who could barely leave his bed. The constant stress and fear had taken a toll on him both physically and mentally, and the witch seemed to take delight in watching him waste away. His hands shook uncontrollably, and he struggled to speak or even move at times. The witch's attacks had become more personal, more direct, and more vicious as the weeks wore on. Each day brought new torments. The witch, with its unnerving voice, would whisper cruel taunts in John's ear, reminding him of its power over him. "Your time is near, John Bell," it would say, filling the room with a dark, ominous energy. Sometimes the voice would mock his weakness, laughing at his failing body, while other times it would grow angry. One evening, threatened as the Bell family gathered in John's room, the witch's presence, the family could only watch in horror as John's condition worsened, thick and suffocating. John lay motionless, his breathing shallow and labored. He had been bedridden for days, and the once vibrant man was now barely recognizable. The room was tense with dread as the witch's voice filled the space again, speaking in low, menacing tones. It declared once more that it had come to end John's life, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The following morning, on December 20th, 1820, John Bell did not wake. Lucy, his wife, was the first to find him lying still in his bed. His breathing had become so faint that, at first, it seemed like he might still be alive. But as she approached, it became clear that he was slipping away. She called for the children, and soon the entire family gathered by John's side, praying for a miracle that would never come. In the midst of their grief, the witch's voice rang out again, cold and triumphant. I did it. I finished what I came to do. The words hung heavy in the air, and the family was left in stunned silence. The witch had claimed responsibility for John Bell's death, just as it had promised it would. There was no mistaking it now. The entity had carried out its grim mission. The cause of John's sudden decline and death had remained a mystery, but in the days following his passing, the family discovered something chilling. Among John's medicine bottles, they found one that contained a strange, unidentified liquid. No one in the family recognized it, and it hadn't been prescribed by the doctor. Desperate for answers, they tested the substance by giving a small amount to the family's cat. Tragically, the animal didn't survive for long after consuming the liquid, confirming the family's worst fears. This mysterious substance had likely been used to poison John Bell. When confronted with this discovery, the witch's voice erupted in gleeful laughter. "I gave him that potion," it proclaimed, reveling in its victory. There was no longer any doubt that the Bell Witch had been responsible for John's death, using the strange liquid to carry out its fatal plan. It was a devastating realization for the Bell family, who had fought so hard to protect John, only to lose him to the very force they had feared for so long. As the Bell family prepared for John's funeral, the witch continued its disturbing behavior. During the solemn event, while friends and neighbors gathered to pay their respects, the entity made its presence known in a horrifying display. The witch's voice interrupted the proceedings, mocking the mourners, laughing loudly, and making crude jokes at the expense of the grieving family. It was a final, cruel insult, adding a layer of humiliation to the pain and sorrow of John Bell's passing. The family was left devastated, unable to escape the reach of the entity, even in their time of mourning. The death of John Bell marked the culmination of the witch's campaign of terror. For years, the Bell family had endured unimaginable horrors, but now the entity had accomplished what it had set out to do from the very beginning. It had taken John's life, and it had done so with a sense of satisfaction and malicious pride. The family was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, unsure of what would happen next. Yet, as dark as things had become, the witch's influence over the Bell household began to wane after John's death. The violent attacks on Betsy grew less frequent, and the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the farm seemed to lift, if only slightly. The entity, it seemed, had fulfilled its purpose, and with John gone, its presence started to fade. Despite the diminishing torment, the Bell family could never truly move on from what had happened. The memory of John's suffering and the witch's cruel laughter haunted them, even as the physical manifestations of the haunting began to dissipate. For the Bell children, especially Betsy, the scars of those years would last a lifetime. John Bell's death left a mark not only on his family, but on the entire community. The story of the Bell Witch spread far beyond Adams, Tennessee, becoming a legend that would be passed down for generations. People from all over the country would hear the tale of the haunting, of the vengeful witch who had taken the life of a man without ever being seen. Though the entity seemed to have accomplished its goal, the question of why it had chosen John Bell and what truly fueled its hatred remained a mystery, one that would linger long after the haunting had ended. In the wake of John Bell's death, the Bell family hoped that the terror that had gripped their home for so many years might finally be over. The Bell Witch, after all, had achieved its dark purpose. It had taken John's life, just as it had promised, and for a while, it seemed that the entity might finally leave them in peace. The violent attacks on Betsy subsided, and the eerie disturbances that had plagued their home began to fade. But even though the immediate threat had diminished, the shadow of the Bell Witch still loomed over the family, the farm, and the entire community. In the months following John Bell's death, the once bustling Bell farmhouse became a place of deep sorrow and quiet reflection. The family tried to rebuild their lives, but the emotional scars left by the witch's torment were too deep to heal easily. Betsy, in particular, had suffered immensely. The physical attacks she had endured were gone, but the emotional trauma lingered. She had been haunted, manipulated, and terrorized by an unseen force that seemed to take joy in her pain. Now, though the witch's voice had gone silent, Betsy was left to grapple with the overwhelming fear and sadness that had become a part of her life. Despite the relative calm that followed John's death, the Bell family couldn't shake the feeling that the witch's presence still lingered, watching and waiting. They continued to hear faint, disembodied whispers from time to time, though the voice was not as aggressive as it once was. It was as if the entity was reminding them that it hadn't truly left, that it still had power over them. For the Bell family, life would never return to the way it had been before the haunting began. The peace they had once known was gone, replaced by the weight of the tragedy they had endured. As time passed, Betsy tried to move forward with her life. She had been engaged to a young man named Joshua Gardner before the haunting escalated, but the strain of the witch's attacks had put their relationship on hold. The entity had made it clear that it disapproved of their union, taunting Betsy about her engagement, and even going so far as to threaten Joshua's life. Betsy had been forced to break off the engagement, fearing that the witch's wrath would bring more suffering to those she loved. Even after John Bell's death, Betsy remained hesitant to reconnect with Joshua. She had no way of knowing whether the witch would return if she reignited the relationship. The fear of bringing the entity back into her life was too great, and so she made the difficult decision to move on. Betsy eventually married another man, Richard Powell, a local school teacher who had been a long-time family friend. Though Powell was much older than Betsy, their marriage brought her some measure of stability, and together they left Adams, Tennessee, to start a new life away from the farm that had become a place of nightmares. For the rest of the Bell family, life continued quietly on the farm. Though the Bell Witch's direct attacks had ceased, the farm remained a source of fascination and fear for the local community. Neighbors and visitors would often talk about the haunting in hushed tones, wondering if the witch might one day return. The legend of the Bell Witch grew, spreading far beyond the small Tennessee town. People from neighboring states came to visit the farm, hoping to catch a glimpse of the paranormal activity that had once terrorized the Bell family. As the years went by, the story of the Bell Witch took on a life of its own. The tale of the vengeful entity that had tormented the Bell family and claimed the life of John Bell became a piece of local folklore, passed down from generation to generation. It was whispered around campfires, told in taverns, and shared among friends. Each retelling seemed to grow more fantastical, adding new details and layers to the story. Some claimed the witch was the spirit of a wronged woman. Others believed it was a demon sent to punish John Bell for some unknown sin. The true origin of the Bell Witch remained a mystery, one that no amount of speculation could solve. Despite the enduring fear surrounding the legend, the Bell family's descendants were able to live relatively peaceful lives after the events. Betsy and her husband lived out the rest of their days away from Adams, and though they could never fully escape the memory of the haunting, they managed to build a life free from the witch's influence. The Bell farm remained in the family for generations, though none who lived there ever experienced the same level of terror that John and Betsy had. However, the Bell Witch wasn't entirely gone. Several years after John Bell's death, the entity reportedly returned to the farm for a brief period. It made its presence known by speaking to members of the Bell family, though its tone was far less menacing than it had been during its original reign of terror. It seemed almost playful this time, offering cryptic messages and making predictions about the future. The witch claimed it would return again one day, though it gave no clear indication of when or why. After a short time, the voice disappeared once more, leaving the family in a state of unease. True to its word, the Bell Witch never fully faded from memory. Even though the farm grew quiet again and no further violent hauntings occurred, the legacy of the witch remained firmly entrenched in the town's history. Locals continued to speak of the Bell Witch in reverent tones, warning their children not to venture too close to the old Bell property after dark, for fear that the spirit might still be lingering, waiting for another chance to wreak havoc. The legend of the Bell Witch has endured for nearly 2 centuries, captivating the imagination of those who hear it. Skeptics have tried to explain away the events as superstition or mass hysteria, while believers hold fast to the notion that something truly supernatural took place on the Bell Farm. The story has inspired countless books, articles, and even films, solidifying its place as one of America's most famous hauntings. To this day, visitors still come to Adams, Tennessee, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Bell Witch or to feel the lingering energy of the entity that once terrorized a family and captivated a nation. Whether they are true believers or merely curious thrill seekers, they all leave with a sense of unease, as if the witch's spirit still lingers in the shadows, watching, waiting for the right moment to return. For the Bell family, the memory of those years will never fade. The death of John Bell, the torment of Betsy, and the voice that haunted their every waking moment left a mark that time could never fully erase. Though the witch's physical presence may have waned, its legacy lives on, a chilling reminder of the power of the unknown and the horrors that sometimes lie just beyond the veil of the ordinary.